Good evening, everybody. Welcome to City Hall. Today we're going to just start the meeting, take the roll, and then jump right into business. So clerk, will you please call the roll?
Agent.
Here.
Halliburton.
Here.
Haney Keith.
Here.
Nash.
Here.
Willits.
Here.
Whittings.
Here.
All present.
Thank you. So today we have the first of many hearings on our modern zoning code. And as those of you who are here know, we'll first hear from staff, a staff presentation, and then we'll hear from neighborhood associations this evening. And then I imagine many members of the public are listening online. I've got quite a bit of folks signed up for Tuesday and Wednesday, but people can still come tomorrow and testify, or Wednesday and testify if you haven't signed up. But tonight we're going to stick with neighborhood associations. I want to thank everybody for being here this evening. Look forward to the conversation. And as we move into this, I just want to emphasize how important it is to each and every one of us that we have this discussion about our community. And I really love these opportunities to hear from residents, hear from neighborhood associations, others, because at the end of the day, there's something that we all always agree on, and that is how much we love this place. And so I appreciate all the time and attention that's been given to this by our staff at the City of Boise to get us to this point, by the committee of volunteers that worked together, learned together, worked together, heard from the public for quite a few years, and then each and every one of you that has provided us testimony already, either in written form or at the Planning and Zoning Commission, and then those of you that will be joining us for the next couple of days. So with that, I'm going to ask Tim Keene to begin the staff presentation.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor, City Council, Tim Keene, Director of Planning and Development Services for the City of Boise. And I will go through a presentation here, Mayor. Let's see, let me make sure I got my slides. Okay. This is kind of the information I'll be going through this evening. I'm going to go through a little bit of a recap of the process that got us to where we are this evening, discuss the basic structure of this ordinance, the goals that we feel like this ordinance allows us to meet as a city, and then talk about the adoption process and the questions that are before council today. I want to start too, Mayor, by thanking everybody that's been so involved in this process. It's been a long one. It's been years that this community's been working on this, and consistently people throughout the city have brought a lot of energy and genuine passion about their city to these deliberations for years. So many meetings, such a variety of discussions around the city. It's been an amazing experience to have residents of this city come so often and bring their aspirations for the city as it grows. It's such a unique opportunity for people. So start by thanking everyone that contributed to this. And I'll also just thank, as the mayor did, Jessica Zelag and her team within the planning department, the planning team within Planning and Development Services, who really shepherded this ordinance through a long, twisty process. It was 57 years ago that the city adopted the ordinance that we have today. And over that 50 to 60 years, a period where, again, 57 years ago, cities in this country were creating a new set of rules. And over that 50, 60 years, we've now seen how successful those ordinances were. The growth of cities over the past 50 and 60 years is characterized by exactly what was encoded with those ordinances that cities created. So the places that we have throughout this country today are in part a product of the ordinances that were created when Boise created its last one 57 years ago. And some things that were common among those ordinances. One is that it separated everything. You know, this whole thing of those ordinances were very exclusionary. The history of zoning is an exclusionary one. That's why it was created, and why in the 60s and 70s cities really doubled down on the degree to which zoning ordinances could exclude people. Number one. Number two, they were drafted with the idea that people would drive to do everything. and resulted in the congested cities that we have today. They resulted in the great struggle that we have creating transit. They are in large part the reason that we are so frustrated by congestion in cities, because nobody has choices for ways to get around. And the last one I'll mention is that think about 50 or 60 years of growth in cities in this country. Clearly, a lot of the environmental calamity that we have in cities and regions in this country are in part due to the way we decided that cities should grow. So we know what that kind of change results in. We're not in a place, nor is any city in a place, to say change won't happen. Of course it will. We're in a city. Change happens every day. The only thing we can be sure about is that things will change. We know what kind of change that would lead Boise to. We see it in every city in this country. So we have a chance here in Boise at a time when it's a formative period in the city's growth. We know we still have great opportunities to intentionally direct the growth of the city towards, number one, solutions to our big problems: housing affordability, mobility, addressing change that results from the changing climate that we have. Let's seek to solve those big problems and also create a stronger community in the process. And we think that zoning is an important decision for the city when it comes to those things. It's not the only decision. There are so many things we have to do as a community to address those big problems. But zoning is an important one because it's the basic frame around which we direct growth of this city. So thank you to everybody who participated in creating what I think is a pretty extraordinary proposal for Boise. Regarding that process, this calendar actually goes back to the fall of 2020. That's when the public process began in earnest. Even before then, the city had engaged a consultant, Clarion, who had done something called a diagnostic, essentially an evaluation of the existing zoning ordinance. I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. They did that leading up to the big public process that started in the fall of 2020. And then I'll note on this calendar as well, the winter, spring of 2022, and then into the summer of 2022, because it was at that time, so a year to 18 months ago, that we really made significant changes to this proposal that's before you because of the public discussion, because of what people were telling us about how they wanted to achieve the goals that we have as a city. So there was a big shift a year to 18 months ago in terms of how we fundamentally organize these regulations, which I'll go through. So this took us through the beginning of this calendar year, which I'll get into a little bit more later in the presentation. Regarding that diagnostic or that evaluation of the existing ordinance that Clarion had done for us, some of the things that it mentioned, and I'll just highlight a few of them here. They found that it was a poor fit with Boise's planning goals, those things that are outlined in Blueprint Boise, poorly designed to protect what people think makes Boise the city that it is, and not at all adequately focused on equity and inclusion. A few of the things that evaluation of the existing ordinance found. In 2020, we created this list, or this group of residents to the city, a citywide advisory committee, which met on a regular basis to discuss the ordinance, what was being drafted, what was being proposed, to give feedback on the proposals every step of the way, and really was a group that would discuss all of these issues in depth. And then following their discussion, we would go to public meetings or public conversations, open houses around the city. So they were instrumental in really helping draft what's before you tonight. I'm sure we'll hear from a few of them this week. The amount of outreach that occurred during this long multi-year process, as I said, the advisory committee met, it turns out, 23 times. There was a variety of public meetings that were done of all types, community conversations, open houses, more conventional public meetings, surveys that were done, lots of responses provided to surveys by residents at multiple times during the process. And why are we changing the zoning code of the city? And it gets back to the city's plan that was adopted in 2011, Blueprint Boise, which recommended how the city should grow. And what did not happen after the plan for the city was adopted in 2011 is the regulations around development of the city were not updated. So this is actually our opportunity to update the regulations to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. And you'll see my last bullet here, which notes that 18 of the 45 actions in the code which directed planning of the city to do something, those 18 of those 45 actions that it recommended related to amending the zoning ordinance, which we're now just getting around to doing. Another thing about our existing ordinance, and this is evidence that we've got a problem, are the amount of, and City Council certainly sees this, the Planning and Zoning Commission see it. So many residents have to devote time to all of these public processes that we have that basically relate to, we have an ordinance that doesn't work. And a couple of examples of that are on the right here. So for example, we've had 282 variances over the last 5 years. So about 5 variances per month. In addition, we've had 245 plan unit developments, or about 4 per month adopted by City Council. So remember that a plan unit development is the opposite of equitable. A plan unit development is a customized zoning ordinance that someone has to create and get approved by council. So we've got even in the last 5 years, 245 of these individual custom designed zoning districts that were created in the city. And remember, you don't just come to City Council on a whim. You've got a team of consultants, you've got a long process to get the zoning approved. The idea that we're for a month of plan unit developments is all the evidence you probably need that we have an ordinance that doesn't work and doesn't provide a consistent level of expectations for people as to how they can build in the city, how we want them to build in the city. Since Blueprint Boise was adopted, we've had a few plans that the community did that are especially noteworthy, I think. One is the housing needs assessment, which was done a few years ago. And it found that in order to address just the demand we have for housing in the city, which is an important thing to address if we care about housing affordability, we needed to permit 2,700 units per year. We're not close to that. We're usually less than half of that units that we permit each year. So we have a basic supply and demand problem in the city, but also within the housing needs assessment that was done, a couple of statements here that are important ones, that we should be seeking to have a balance of housing types so that we can build beyond our big inventory of single family detached houses that we've got, again, back to the zoning ordinance of 1966, which envisioned a very small number of building types. In fact, outlawed a diversity of building types, that we get back and allow a greater diversity of building types, which had been the tradition in Boise. We need a greater diversity of building types, which includes multifamily dwellings, live-work opportunities, all kinds of buildings in the city. This is what the housing needs assessment had found recently. Also, the climate action roadmap at the city, which was done a few years ago as well, and it speaks to essentially how the development pattern in the city is the most important climate-related action that we must address as a city if we are to adapt to this changing climate. A few notes from that study: development regulation. We need development regulations that will help further the community's sustainability objectives. In addition, the benefits of energy efficient buildings will be lost in the future if occupants of those buildings must drive 20 minutes to the nearest grocery store. Lots of statements within the climate roadmap that speak to how that development pattern is integral to the city addressing, and really it's the opportunity that Boise has. We're in a city that sits within substantially intact landscape. And if we lose that, and as we grow, then we've missed the whole challenge around climate. And the last one I'll mention is the Transportation Action Plan, also completed a few years ago. A couple of statements from it. One is that land use policies outlined for downtown Boise and the city's transit corridors and mixed-use activity centers are intended to support existing and future transit and enable more residents the ability to choose alternative modes of transportation. In addition, without the implementation of such land use policies and the concentrations of housing and services and jobs will ultimately result in the viability of rapid transit. So anyway, the point being, of course, that the city's transportation action plan was speaking to this issue of the way in which we develop the land, the way we occupy the land is so integral to whether or not we'll have a transportation system that, number one, where people have choices, and we can avoid what's happened in so many cities as it relates to no choice means congestion for everybody. So the thing about this ordinance that I think is especially exciting for Boise is that it is really shaped to be of this physical place. So this is something that rarely is done. And, it's been since 1966 that we created an ordinance. The most important thing that we should be doing is we should be creating a structure of development in the city that is commensurate with the physical characteristics of Boise. Since this existing ordinance was adopted, it's hard to really tell what it wants of the city. It's become very confusing as to what are we trying to be as a city. So this new ordinance, what the great clarity of this and what we're really excited about is the way in which it is really tied to the physical characteristics of the city. So we do think that the ordinance that you have before you is an excellent structure because of that. And an important part of it is that we've tied the affordability and sustainability goals that we have in the city to the incentives, the way that we've designed it, for instance. So we basically have the structure that's commensurate with the physical city. And then we have the goals that we have around affordability and sustainability woven into the code such that there are incentives that make that kind of development that is so of the city and helps make it include those things that we care so much about. A few things about that. The first is this idea that we're building where we've already got investment. This is such an important aspect of this code. It's when you think about the city and its growth, one of the things that you all are so concerned about and we must care so much about is, can we afford it? Do we have a development pattern that is building on the infrastructure that we have and is of a type that we can service most efficiently? And that's why we've made this such a central theme within this ordinance, that we've got to grow in a way that we're not constantly spreading our services and infrastructure further and further from the city, because that makes us less economically sustainable as a city. A few things about that. The first is our downtown district, which is called MX5. So currently we have a downtown zoning district that is called C5. That is going away. We now have MX5, and the area that's covered by the downtown zoning is actually bigger than the current C5 district. So it includes Shoreline, it includes the Lust district. So we've got the downtown district, which has no density limitations. It gets rid of this awkward, not appropriate FAR requirement in the downtown area. It gets rid of off-street parking requirements in the downtown areas. We have some areas of downtown right now that don't have off-street parking requirements, but some do, because you've got these overlays. It's a very odd thing. So the MX5 in this thing, downtown, the core, where the more people we have living there, the better. We have a district that really cleans up where we've got inadequacies with the current downtown district. The second one that's in this ordinance, again, related to the city that this is this MX4 district. We're only applying it in this proposal to 4 locations on State Street, where the city's been working for years on a BRT line, the city and the region. Lots of planning done, and those 4 stops identified on State Street. So we have this transit-oriented district here, which could be applied other places in the future as we advance with our transit investments. But for now, it would be just at those 4 locations that we've already identified in State Street. The very important MX3 district, which we're applying to the State Street, Fairview, and Vista corridors, and also activity centers. This directly comes out of the city's plan. One of the things we changed substantially last summer was the mixed-use districts of the city at the time were just one size fits all. And one of the great things that happened as a result of the public discussions last year is we really shaped these MX districts, the mixed-use districts, to again put the density where it's helpful. So we put density on those 3 streets and in these activity centers, more height, more compact development in those locations. And we chose those corridors because that's where we have the best transit service today, where we think we can improve transit service in the future. Clearly, as we invest in transit in the city, the degree to which we can make even bigger investments in those, we can move the MX around, but it's the right district for those kinds of locations. We've got this R2 conversion. So one of the things that we proposed in this ordinance is that along those corridors, again, Vista, State, and Fairview, that for the properties adjacent to the corridors themselves, so 1 block back, that we would rezone those properties to R2, which is a little denser. So you've got a step down from the main street, like Fairview, then down to this R2, which is still just residential, but it's not as tall as you'd have on that main street, and then down to the single family. So the way this is arranged in the current ordinance, or what we're proposing, is that what gets rezoned to R2 is essentially 1/8 of a mile back from the center line of each of those streets. If you're in that area, you become the R2. So again, back to creating an ordinance, districts that are shaped around this physical place and what we're trying to achieve. The R2 is an important aspect of that. We decided last summer to keep all the R1 districts that we've got. So there was talk early in this process of consolidating those districts, and rather than having the ones we have, we would consolidate some of them, and we decided not to do that. We said, let's keep all of them because we've got a variety of neighborhoods. We have some neighborhoods with very large lots. We have more conventional suburban ones. We've got the traditional ones, which tend to be older than compact neighborhoods, most of them more center to the city, and urban neighborhoods. So an important decision, so that we would acknowledge the variety of neighborhoods we have, and we would encode those neighborhoods within this new ordinance. The next thing that we did was as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to shape an ordinance around the city that we have, but then we wanted to, and this again was a year to 18 months ago when we really started to talk about, let's design this ordinance such that the things that we want to achieve as a city are incorporated such that they're incentives. So some important ones here. So within those R1 districts, as you know, currently in the city today, you've got the right to do 2 units on any lot. So one thing that we said is if you go above those 2 units, we'd allow you to do that. But if you do that, then the additional units have to be affordable. This is a strong message from the community last year, a year or so ago, when people were saying, if you permit this additional density in the R1, but we're not getting affordable housing, then what are you really addressing? And I understand the argument. Certainly that part of this is just supply, and having more units is helpful, and that's absolutely true. Clearly, this ordinance is designed to increase supply. But a lesson from other cities, that we feel like that was an important point that was being made, is we've got to tie the affordability to that increase in density. So we created that incentive. The second one was what we call strategic infill, a very important one. Again, coming out of that public process was, hey, let's address some of these concerns that we've heard about density in neighborhoods and go ahead and design an incentive that speaks to those concerns. So the first thing is, if you've got a property on a busier street, so a collector or an arterial type street, we have many homes on such streets in neighborhoods throughout the city, completely geographically representative of every part of the city, has streets like that. And you've got a vacant lot, or you save the existing structure and incorporate that, then you can actually get up to 12 units. You get 4 by right. Then you can do 5 to 8, provided one of those units is affordable, and you can do 9 to 12 if 2 of them are. The idea being, again, let's address some of the concerns we've heard about where these are located. Okay, busier streets, number one. Number two, not encouraging the demolition of existing structures, vacant lot, or reuse the existing structure, and then tying some affordability to those increases in density. The idea throughout this ordinance, of course, is that we can achieve some level of affordability throughout the city, not in one particular area, but in every neighborhood. So having those units spread around the city is exactly what we're trying to accomplish with this ordinance. Then the adaptive reuse section, which also allows you to renovate an existing structure for multiple units. We've made some additional flexibility around ADUs and had some parking reductions associated with affordability and height flexibility as well when you're addressing these incentives that the city, or these goals that the city has around affordability and sustainability. As it addresses our goals here, we feel like as a result of that structure and the basic way in which this ordinance is designed to enable the growth of this city in a way that is most helpful given our physical characteristics, we feel like this helps us address these big goals that we have around housing options, around a development pattern that is sustainable, around transportation choices, and just being cognizant of the environment we're within. As it relates to housing options, let me get to that. As it relates to housing options, so the way this is broken down, of course, is that we've got neighborhood scale homes in neighborhoods. So this is not proposing that we do anything but enable within our neighborhoods housing types that traditionally have been there, you know, a single family house or a duplex or a small apartment building or a cottage court. That's what it's proposing for neighborhoods. When you think of the structure of the city, that's a hugely important part of it, that we have the neighborhood scale, which this is suggesting we have a greater diversity of housing within those areas. But then we have taller, more compact buildings on transit corridors and downtown and activity centers. That's what gives us the ability to have a greater option of housing, but in places that are appropriate, where density is helpful again. Creating a development pattern that's predictable. I want to make note of a few of these bullets here. One is align approval processes to desired outcomes. Again, lesson from other cities here, or even over the past few years. If you create and enable new types of development to address these issues, especially housing affordability, but you don't address the way that your process works, then you're going to be very frustrated because it's going to be hard to build what you're saying you want. So we've got to address this issue of, you know, we said it a lot during the public process, is we want to put the community in a position where they can help make this ordinance successful, not just design our arguments, but actually figure out how do we put the community in a position to ensuring this ordinance is successful. And we do that by addressing the processes of approval, addressing our climate goals, of course, and I'll mention the assured water supply that's part of this ordinance. Of course, this is new for the city, and we think a very important element of the ordinance is that we ensure that there's water supply associated with new development in the city. Transportation options, again, that the development pattern supports the investment in transit, that neighborhoods have things to walk to. We've included the neighborhood cafe or small retail component of this ordinance so that we can have those things in more parts of the city. We've traditionally had them in Boise, but this ordinance proposes to permit by right neighborhood cafes, small retail in our neighborhoods. Safe and comfortable environment for all users of our streets, and make sure that people can get around safely and conveniently. And then that we acknowledge that we're in a specific place. You know, we have this intact landscape that the city sits within. If in the process of growth, we lose that, then we've lost what the city is. That's what we've seen cities do for the past 50, 60 years, is the growth of the place has literally destroyed the landscape they sit within. We can't let that happen in Boise. No one is interested in that, I don't think. I mean, the idea that we grow by moving into the desert and farmland and the hills, that is a prescription for losing everything that makes this place what it is. And this ordinance is very intentionally about ensuring that that is something Boise doesn't have to accommodate in order to grow. That's not the kind of change that we understand Boise residents are interested in. With regard to where we are in the adoption process, now this is a more recent calendar. So we have the ordinance, the ordinance that we have before us tonight was actually released in February. So we went through that longer process that I showed you earlier. We ended up releasing this ordinance to the public in February of this year. We then, of course, went to the Planning and Zoning Commission in April, and they recommended it. So here we're at City Council. Council will have these hearings. Council will vote on whether to approve this ordinance or not, and then we'll set an effective date on when the ordinance would become effective and go once we start using it. I'll note that since the February release of the ordinance, we've had 1,547 written comments that we've received. With regard to what's actually happening in front of City Council this week, we've got two applications here. The first is the zoning code amendment to repeal and replace our chapter 11 of the city code, which is the zoning ordinance. And then we've got amendments to the comprehensive plan. The amendments to the comprehensive plan are minor ones that just address the change in nomenclature and so forth, the different zoning districts we're proposing. This is the zoning ordinance that's before you. It includes all these sections, including 17 zoning districts, the use regulations, design and development standards, and so forth. That is the ordinance that is before City Council, but it also has a new map for the city. So we've got a conversion map that rezones property in the city based on a set of rules which we published and are part of the ordinance. So we have a set of conversion rules that we publish and are part of the ordinance, and the conversions will go on. In addition, anything that's happening between now and the effective date, ultimately will be converted once the ordinance if council adopts the ordinance this week, the things that come into the city or are rezoned between now and the effective date would also get rezoned based on the conversion map once the new ordinance becomes effective. The comprehensive plan text amendment replacing references to the existing zoning districts with the new proposed districts, replacing the term land use map with future land use map. We did update the airport influence language there was some confusion there about the airport influence areas within the comprehensive plan. So we made those changes. With regard to the Planning and Zoning Commission recommendation, as I mentioned, we had a series of hearings at Planning and Zoning Commission in April. We actually had 10 hours of public comment. We had 139 people speak. We had 14 neighborhoods that presented on the first night. The Planning Commission, as you know, asked a lot of questions, had quite a bit of discussion about it, and ultimately voted unanimously to recommend the new ordinance to City Council. The Planning and Zoning Commission on the last evening then did identify some things for us to consider, which included the creation of an executive summary, which has been created. A lot of discussion about neighborhood plans and how those can be incorporated into the ordinance, or even just the shortcomings in terms of neighborhood plans, but how ultimately they could be incorporated into the development review process. The importance of coordinating with Valley Regional Transit. Obviously, transit is fundamental to the way in which we're shaping the zoning ordinance, the importance of that coordination. The implementation of performance measures to the ordinance, which we're actually preparing right now. So depending on council's decision this week, we would be prepared if it is approved by council and becomes effective, that we'd have a way to measure those, the success of the ordinance. Discussion around how much time neighborhood associations get at public hearings, and then consideration for notification of neighbors in cases of type 2 applications. This has to do with development building in the ordinance, which does not include a public hearing. The discussion was around, in those cases, could the neighbors get notified? A little bit more about what we've shared with council since the Planning Commission deliberation of this. And this was in a memo that I sent to you on June 1st, but there were edits, just kind of redlined corrections to be made. This was sent to the Planning Commission before their hearings. We do, if council decides to deliberate and approve this ordinance, we would want it to include those red lines that we identified back on April 13th memo. We also included in our recent memo to you some changes that we're proposing. Some of this basically just comes from the public discussion that we had at the Planning and Zoning Commission. Just a reference, the first one is just a reference to the conversion table. The second thing relates to the airport influence areas and true confusion around the influence areas versus the noise exposure maps, or just getting rid of the noise exposure map reference and just referencing the influence areas. Discussion about the WUI fence requirements and clarity around that. In fact, you don't have to put up a fence at all, but if you do, the standards around the fences and the WUI, which is the areas that are subject to wildfire and adjacent to areas of wildlife. We are proposing to expand. So in this ordinance, we have a provision that says that already, and when we went to the Planning Commission, we presented this, that if you're working in an MX3 or an MX5 district or an MX4, and you've got an existing assisted living center, nursing home, mobile home park, even naturally occurring affordable housing, that in those cases, if you're redeveloping it, that it has to get a conditional use permit. We're actually proposing that be extended to the R2, R3, MX1, and MX3 districts as well. So that same provision would apply in those districts. A typo on the duplex, triplex, fourplexes, deleting the section on sidewalk cafe. And this came up because the city actually has a separate chapter of its code related to sidewalk cafes, and by including it here in the zoning ordinance, we felt it was creating more confusion. And so what we'd like to do with sidewalk cafes is, and what we're proposing is to delete that section, and let's come back to the discussion around sidewalk cafes as it relates to the chapter of the city code that actually deals with sidewalk cafes. We had some recommendations for changes to the manufactured home section of the ordinance that came from manufactured home industry. And so we thought those were really good suggestions. So we incorporated them into this ordinance. It's outlined in that memo that we sent you. We did make some changes to the setbacks for small detached accessory structures on properties. Y'all will remember a recent discussion around a small shed that somebody was putting on their property, and it was a lot of effort and pain over something that wasn't necessary. So we shifted some standards there. The removal of surety bonds as a form of financial security in the cases of improvements that people have to make in a subdivision and so forth. Updating the language on assured water supply. A lot of thanks to Steve Hubble and Public Works Department in the city who's been working with us on this. We've got an updated version of that language based on their continued refinement of those standards to make sure they work as well as they can. We've added a timeline for the interdepartmental review as it relates to the neighborhood meeting so that someone has to get to an interdepartmental meeting 4 months after, no more than 4 months after they have a neighborhood meeting. The concern was that people would have a neighborhood meeting and then wait for long periods of time before they actually submit for approval. So we want to avoid that. Just a small change as it relates to utilities, changing the word controlled to regulated. And then we did bring back the record of survey. In the ordinance, we're proposing to eliminate the record of survey as an option for subdivision of small subdivisions of property. We're proposing to bring that back for cases where you've got development that's taking advantage of the incentives that we have in the ordinance related to affordability. So if you're coming in and you're doing an affordable housing development based on our incentives, then you would have the right to go to a record of survey. A few things that are not addressed in this ordinance. So those are all matters that were within the ordinance. A few things that we did not address, and we mentioned these just because there were times during the process where they were very much a dominant discussion within the public meetings. One is wireless communications. The city had gone through a process fairly recently, within the last 2 years, to update our standards around wireless communications. We're not proposing to change those in this code. Inclusionary zoning, and you've seen feedback that we've gotten via a memo on the right or not, the fact that we don't have the right to do inclusionary zoning in the city. It's an interesting aspect of, or consideration as it relates to how we design this ordinance with all these incentives, but it does not include what you would probably define as inclusionary zoning. We're not addressing short-term rentals. That's something that the city did very recently. And the last thing is we had a huge discussion around shelters, of course, about a year or so ago, which resulted in the approval of a shelter on State Street. We decided last summer, 14 months ago or so, that we would not change the shelter standards within this ordinance and hold that conversation for later, since this ordinance was really around the basic shape of the city, what kind of density and housing types we were seeking. We felt like that would really be an understandable distraction if we really brought that into this ordinance. So we want to put that off till later. As it relates to the findings for approval, after council holds these hearings this week and we have all the Q&A and discussion around this proposed ordinance, in council's deliberation, if there is a motion and a vote to approve this, we've got, again, number one, the zoning ordinance repeal and replace on chapter 11, and the things that you would find that it complies and conforms to the comprehensive plan, that it establishes a set of land use and design standards that are consistent with Blueprint Boise and the 65 recommendations of Blueprint Boise. I noted a few of those tonight. It's clearly the whole purpose of this is to create an ordinance that actually is consistent with Blueprint Boise, is required for public convenience and general welfare, provides the city with zoning tools to achieve those goals that we have for the city related to sustainability, efficiency, responsible development pattern. Findings for approval that relate to the comprehensive plan, it's required to, this is again, language that is state law related to, is required for the public convenience or necessity, general welfare, ensure that the comprehensive plan uses language and terminology that's consistent with the development code. So again, we're changing the nomenclature to be consistent with the ordinance that we have before you, the new zoning code, and that the comprehensive plan amendments are necessary to reflect language consistency and the terminology being consistent between the zoning code and the comprehensive plan, and that it's in compliance with the goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan. Won't create inconsistencies, not place an undue burden on transportation or other public facilities in in the city and in our planning area would not adversely affect the delivery of services. So here's our responses to those things. But this is technically, when it comes to a motion, the findings that are relevant as it relates to these two actions that are before council this week. So in conclusion, the Planning and Zoning Commission recommended unanimously for approval of what's before you this week. We will need a motion approval of both the zoning, the replacement of our zoning ordinance, Chapter 11, as well as the comprehensive plan amendments, with the amendments noted in that April 13th memo that went to the Planning Commission before their public hearings, as well as we're recommending those changes that we outlined for you on June 1st. And then one thing that we will have to do this week, of course, if council acts to approve this, would be to set an effective date for the ordinance. So that is the conclusion of my presentation, and happy to answer questions about any of those topics or anything that I didn't touch on.
Madam Mayor?
Sure.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to try to make a habit of doing this several times throughout the process. I want to thank you for all the work that you put into this. I want to thank all the staff for all the work that they put into this, the advisory committee, the neighborhood associations, everyone who's testified. Thank you for being part of this process, and thanks to fellow council members and the mayor as well. Question just as far as like process goes. So at the end of this, hopefully on Thursday, we have a decision to make, and the decision could be, we don't like this, we're going to deny this. We could vote to approve it, or there's a third option where you could vote to approve it and potentially you're making some changes along the way. Changes could be potentially major, changes could be minor. And I'm wondering if you could kind of walk us through that process of, if you voted to approve, but or if you, during this testimony, somebody gave a really, really great idea and you're like, we actually should change this. If we were going to move towards the approval process, how would we go about doing that?
Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, you are correct. That third option is certainly one before council. And as a matter of fact, you could describe what we've provided to you as an example of that. So we provided you with a memo on June 1st, which recommends a list of changes that we felt were important based on the public discussion that's gone on since this was introduced in February. So council member, what would happen is if that third option was the one that council chose, is just we'd have to outline what those changes are that you would like to see within the ordinance as part of the motion that you make and the vote that you take as council on Thursday, if that in fact is what we come to.
And Madam Mayor, just to follow up on that one. So as council members up here who have, quite a bit of knowledge, but maybe not experts on, some of the exact ways it would be written in code, we would tell you what the intention of what we wanted to be changed would be. And then staff would go back and they would actually make sure that that language worked, was correct, and had the ability to put in there in some sort of additional findings or revised findings for a future vote. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. And then my last question for now, there was one more thing that I thought that I had seen in the memo that maybe was related to billboards and versus 20 seconds to 8 seconds. I don't know if you reviewed that or not. So like if that was something that we were going to add or amend towards the end, then if a motion was being made, I would say, I would like to make sure that we address this issue from 20 to 8 seconds, and then the staff would go back and they'd figure out a way to change that. Am I kind of understanding that correctly? Both?
Yes, council member, thank you for raising that. I thought, oh, here it is. Okay, I skipped right over that. This is on our list, number 11 here, off-premise signs, which is a billboard. And what was included within our memo on June 1st is that we go back to the existing dwell time that we have within the ordinance, for a digital board, how much time it can stay static. It's 8 seconds now. We were proposing to make it 20. So we're suggesting that we go back and keep it as it is, which is the 8 seconds. So yeah, I just skipped right over that.
Yeah. And had that not been on there, I could have made that recommendation at the end. If council would have approved it, then we could have added it to a final motion if that's the direction the motion was going to go.
Yes, what I'd suggest is that is indeed the process. So on Thursday, after we've heard from the public and we move into deliberation, if you have a list, whether it be the list of technical changes that staff has recommended or other things you'd like to change based on community feedback, that you direct staff to incorporate those changes into the ordinance as we go through the reading process, if you decide to move it to reading.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Again, appreciate it and all the work from the staff.
Any other questions for Tim?
Madam Mayor. Tim, thank you so much. And as somebody who has been in this process now, I think for 15 years since we developed our comprehensive plan, it's pretty gratifying to see all of the work that's gone in, all of the neighborhoods being involved, and everyone really coming together and telling us how much they care about our city and about the future of our city and how it's going to look and feel and act for our residents now and into the future. One thing that I wanted to see if you would touch on is, and since Councilmember Clegg is no longer at the dais, is trees and landscaping a little bit and how this code interacts with that, and if there's anything new or anything different as far as landscaping.
Mayor, Councilmember Woodings, yes, thank you for raising that as well. I skipped over in one of the slides. One of the slides about the city's goals has to do with landscape and tree canopy, and there are elements of this new ordinance that do speak directly to that. Some of it relates to landscape standards that don't require landscaping that is so water consumptive. There's that aspect of this code. There's also new tree planting requirements in the code that includes more type 3 trees. So in the city's tree standards, the type 3 tree is the largest canopy trees. And we have very few places in the existing code that permit or require type 3 trees. So we've added the type 3, the largest canopy trees, to part of our requirements within this ordinance. So that's a change. We worked closely with the city's forester around these changes such that the tree standards in this ordinance are ones that the city has been aspiring to for quite some time. So, so we feel like this ordinance is directly addressing issues around landscape and tree canopy that have been discussed for quite some time in Boise and have only been applied on a case-by-case basis. They're included in this ordinance to apply in any case.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm going to let other council members ask any questions that they have, but I appreciate being able to pull that question out of left field and you being able to answer it so thoroughly. Thanks, Tim.
Madam Mayor, I really feel so strongly that this is the most important thing that we can be doing as a city, and then as the city leaders. The zoning code and the land use touches everything. We've been working on it for 5 years. The amount of public participation has been truly incredible. The amount of staff time and the amount of human hours that have gone into this is probably uncountable. So I want to express my gratitude that such an important thing has gotten that attention. And I wanted to call to attention something you touched on very briefly and ask you to elaborate on it, because I think it is one of the coolest things about this draft. And that is the relationship between the shape of this new code and the current shape of our city. In other words, instead of sitting down with a big sheet of paper and an empty Western landscape and laying out, the manufacturing will be here and the houses will be here, we've done something quite different. Everybody's done something quite different in putting this together. We have a river, we have the transportation corridors, we have the things that we cherish and value, like the open spaces surrounding it, the untouched landscape, right? I forget how you phrased it. And it was such an elegant and I think maybe easy to underappreciate point that you made. I wonder if you could repeat it and elaborate on it a little bit more.
Well, Mayor, Councilmember Bajan, I think thank you for raising this issue again, because it really, when you think about creating a new zoning ordinance for the first time in 60 years, this is the fundamental issue, which is that you organize your regulations around the physical city that you are and the way you want that physical city to change. It's not, what's being proposed is not one solution. to our problems. What this ordinance includes is many solutions to all these issues. It's not a one headline zoning ordinance. And that has to do with the degree to which we were concerned that we ensured that the physical city was understood and represented in this set of regulations. So this issue of protecting the intact landscape around us, I mean, that is foremost in our thinking, is if we are to have success in that, and it's not easy, the zoning ordinance isn't the only challenge we have as a community that relates to protecting the landscape around us, but it's a very important one. And if we can't become really good at growing in the opposite direction, which is within ourselves, then we're not going to have much success. I mean, in 1966, we weren't experts in sprawl. You know, that was a new idea for everybody. We became experts in it. And so now we have this chance to become an expert in something else, which is growing within ourselves. And for that to work and for people to welcome it over time, it has to be built on the physical place that we are as a city. That's the most important thing. You can take any one of these individual standards or any of the incentives and beat them up and discuss them, move them around, change them. I'm certain they'll change over time. But the physical place has to be something that this thing understands well and is shaped around. That's the fundamental issue. And that's why we feel so strongly this is the right move for the city. Yes, we'll continue to evaluate how the standards themselves work and how those incentives work, how successful they are. And we'll keep working to make them more and more successful. But we think we got the shape right, and we can address those big goals, as I mentioned at the beginning, around housing affordability and mobility, and addressing the landscape around us in a way that protects it. It gives us that chance because it's built on this physical place, and that's rarely done.
The more I sort of chew on that, the more profound it seems. I'm really looking forward to hearing what the public has to say, both down in the weeds on the technical standards and about these fundamental big picture kind of bones of the house level values that you're trying to target here. So I'm really looking forward to this week, and thank you for all your work.
Madam Mayor, Director Keene, thank you so much. I'll just echo my colleagues' praise. I know this has been a long haul. There's been a lot of effort that's gone into this, and we're at this point, and I just appreciate the staff and all that they've done to answer our questions and answer the community's questions and the gravity of what we're doing here. And I don't think it's lost on anybody that this is the most important thing that we do, is create the kind of city that we want to live in. I want to put a finer point on the water regulation piece about the assured water supply. You know, we all understand that we live in a desert, the water is gold, the importance of clean water. The memo from June talks about, there's some concerns that's come up about this piece, whether we're in the right lane, you know, whether we have the regulatory authority or where that lies. And could you expand on that, about the city's role and how that works with Department of Water Resources and some of the other partners within the state that regulate water?
Mayor, Councilmember Willits, I'm happy to speak to this. I think we might have, Steve Hubble and Mary Grant are here, and they've really been working on this language, especially since the Planning and Zoning Commission, because we did get that feedback that you mentioned, and they've been working to make this a better and better version of the ordinance. I might ask them to speak to this. Mary?
Madam Mayor, council members, with respect to that regulatory authority, as you mentioned, there are several state agencies that do regulate various aspects of it. I'll try to summarize and just capture as best as possible. So we've got, like, I would say 3 primary agencies. One is the Idaho Department of Water Resources. They're primarily responsible for the appropriation of water rights. So they'll tell you whether you have a water right and what that beneficial use would be. The second would be the Public Utilities Commission, which is what is the rate making agency with respect to charges for a public water utility. So Capital Water, Veolia Water, they're regulated by the PUC with respect to what they can charge customers on a tariff. The third one is with respect to Department of Environmental Quality, and they really are what regulate the water quality aspects. And they also, so some of the changes that you saw proposed, they also look at financial capability, infrastructure for delivery of that capacity. Idaho Department of Water Resources also looks at some of that. So the way that we've put this forward is those agencies regulate quality, quantity, and cost of the water supply resource. And what this modern zoning code is looking to do is look to the reliability and continuity of that water source as it relates to development, and specifically with just that view on the relation to land use approvals within the city's regulatory authority of that planning and zoning. If you look to the Land Use Planning Act, it does have as a list of criteria that the city can consider water supply resources and other aspects of natural resources, environmental benefit, quality concerns, those types of things with respect to those land use approvals.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Tim. Very, very helpful. I know that there's a lot of water, a lot involved here. So with this portion of the code, could the city deny an application based on lack of water supply?
Likely what the implementation guidance would be with respect to, and I could also defer a little bit to Haley Falconer, who's been working on the implementation aspect, but that we would likely condition the development with respect to your water supply is showing that you can support this amount of development. And if you want to go get another water source, or if there are different ways that you can supply that water, that we would condition the development on that. If the city were to deny an application with respect to this water supply, it would not affect any of the state regulated aspects of that water. It would only, so for example, if we denied an application, it wouldn't then turn around and require Veolia to do something with respect to that development. It would only really be a denial with respect to that particular land use application. Nothing that would, I guess, breach the lane or cross the lane over into a different aspect that would affect some state regulated aspect.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, can I just ask Mary one clarifying question? As I understood it, we're not regulating water. We're not regulating water quality. We're not regulating water price. We're not regulating water use. We are regulating land use. We are regulating development patterns, and we are regulating like where people put structure. So we're staying out of regulating water. And my understanding of the code was that we were very deliberate about doing that, about respecting our lane, but not being preempted. So we're not going to regulate water, but we are going to regulate how people use land within our city. Is that basically right?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Bajent, that's correct.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question about the general provisions of this. When I first started reading through my my book, the purpose statement really kind of struck me as like really hitting the nail on the head. And I just wanted to see if you have some insight, some history into how that purpose statement that went into this code was developed, who it was developed with, kind of who was involved in that conversation.
Mayor, Councilmember Woodings, did you want to speak to it? Did you want to read it? I don't have it in front of me.
Yes. So some of the things that I highlighted in this, so this is a 7-part purpose statement. It talks about affordable and fair housing, economic opportunity, diverse, inclusive communities, a variety of housing choices, protecting natural areas, achieving an integrated approach to land use and transportation with high quality urban design, and protecting the city's historic resources. So it really was like this overarching value statement that I saw reflected throughout this. And so I was just kind of curious, like, how did that get developed? You know, who was involved in creating this purpose statement?
Well, the development of the purpose statement started late last year, and I think really is intended to be reflective of Blueprint Boise. So if you take the language that you see now in that purpose statement, you'll recognize much of it from statements in Blueprint Boise that were adopted by City Council in 2011. So really, it was the team working on the ordinance itself, Jessica's team and the planning department, the consultants, but really the content of it came from Blueprint Boise.
That is great history. It's kind of it's a really fun full circle moment for those of us who were around back then when we were developing and adopting Blueprint Boise. And then when I came to council, I remember chatting with Cody Riddle back then. I was like, when are we gonna, update our zoning code? And I had a lot to learn about the comprehensive plan and how it interacted with the zoning code. I learned a lot since I've been on council about when those two things are actually in conflict, and those lead to our latest nights at this dais. So I think it's wonderful to recognize that history of we've been working on this for a long time. There's a lot of people in this city who were involved in Blueprint Boise and now have been involved in conversations on how we put Blueprint Boise into an actual zoning code that makes sense and create, really is where the rubber hits the road on creating that vision for the future of our city. So I really appreciate that. That's good history. Thanks, Tim.
Madam Mayor. Tim, a couple of technical things for you. So you had a slide that had some recommendations from the Planning and Zoning Commission for us to take a look at. There we go. I've got some questions, I think, specifically about the last two. First one being where it says evaluate the time neighborhood associations are provided at public hearings. And I'm wondering if you could tell us what exists now, and then also what exists in the zoning code, proposed zoning code.
Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, what's proposed in the ordinance that's before you this week is that neighborhood associations would be given 5 minutes at any public hearing. The existing ordinance, I am going to have to ask for some help on because we've discussed this. I don't know, Deanna, do you? Reason I'm hesitating is there's been discussion. I think it's not consistent.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say
is
so
the
much of
issue
it
why I'm
is
struggling
subject
with the
to
answer.
decision and negotiations
Yeah,
currently.
Thank you, Mayor. Do you want to speak to it?
Yeah. Madam Mayor, council members, for the record, my name is Jessica Zelak. I'm the Deputy Planning Director, and I don't have the language right in front of me, but it states in the current code today that the time for neighborhood associations at hearings to provide testimony, and it depends on if they're the appellant or during the original presentation, could be at the discretion of the hearing body or the time to match the applicants. And so over time, that has kind of morphed to be mostly at the discretion of whether it's design review committee or historic preservation, planning and zoning, or city council to generally be about the amount of time that the applicant has.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. My experience is that like maybe a developer presents and their time takes 8 minutes long. And then we say, okay, neighborhood association, you get 8 minutes to kind of match the amount of time that they're given. And I understand that I think one of the issues that was brought up with this and the reason why we tried to make it a little bit more official was that if you're preparing for a presentation and you don't know whether or not it's going to be like 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, kind of hard for the neighborhood association to figure some of those things out. And so I think the attempt here with the 5 minutes is just to have a more defined time so that people can prepare for. And then maybe the discussion at the P&Z Commission is that I'm sure that there's a request, and based off some of the comments that I've gotten for that 5 minutes isn't enough. And that kind of seems like where the P&Z Commission is recommending us to evaluate a little bit more.
Councilmember Halliburton, you're exactly correct. And thank you for pointing out that the concern we heard from so many neighborhoods was just the fact that they couldn't count on a specific amount of time at the public hearing. So we did incorporate the 5 minutes, but there were some at the P&Z hearings that were requesting more than 5 minutes.
And Madam Mayor, I don't think that there's anything else in the code in addition to that, as far as any other requirements or anything else. It's just basically outlines you would have 5 minutes. And that's actually, I think, even different than an appeal because that would be a different time frame. This is just in response to an application that comes in front of council, and there's no real other guidance beyond just the 5 minutes kind of guaranteed time.
It would be that you get 5 minutes in any case, when you've got any kind of case in front of the Planning and Zoning Commission or City Council or the Historic Preservation Commission or Design Review Commission.
Perfect. And then the second one on there was just evaluate the notification provided for type 2 applications. I'm wondering if you could dive into that just a little bit more,
Right.
kind of what the concern was, what exists right now.
So one important aspect of this ordinance is, so the ordinances, zoning ordinances are somewhat complex. They're regulations for thousands of properties over, in Boise's case, about 85 square miles, and addressing construction that could be the addition to a house or the addition of a small shed on your property to a 20 or 30-story building. So there's some complexity to them. What we're seeking to do with this is simplify it by creating these 4 types of approvals: type 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in the case of type 1 and 2 approvals, there's no public hearing associated with those. Back to the point of, let's put the community in a position to help make this ordinance successful. How do we make the things that we want easier to do? That includes less unpredictable process. So we put those things in type 2. Now, if you're a type 3 or 4, you do go to a public hearing somewhere. Could be Planning and Zoning Commission, could be all the way to City Council, could be the Historic Preservation Commission or Design Review Commission. But this one relates to those type 2s, which don't require a public hearing. And the discussion was, could in those cases, if we get an application for a type 2, when we have that application and we've reviewed it and approved it, can we notify the neighbors? So there was a variety of ways in which that was expressed. The Planning and Zoning Commission related to, it'd be good if we know, and others can speak to this. We've got hours of public discussion coming up, so anyone can characterize this, but it'd be good to know so that if there's a way for us to help make sure that is done properly, we can, it's a neighborly thing. Let us know, and that way we can accommodate what's happening in the community. So the request was, in those type 2 cases where you're not going to a public hearing, let us know when something is being built based on those type 2 applications.
And Madam Mayor, just the last follow-up there. So the intention behind that might be, we have a dashboard that we're already planning so people can kind of follow development that's going in their area, but that notification might be, so if somebody saw that, maybe they didn't like it, and they wanted to appeal, then there's the potential from that to go from being approved by staff to then having to go to, is it the hearing examiner?
It would go to the hearing examiner. An appeal in the case of a type 2 would go to the hearing examiner, not to Planning and Zoning.
Thank you.
Mayor. Tim, you've done a nice job of talking about the process and the goals. And we've had the privilege of having regular updates on this. And, it is massive. I'm wondering if you can take us through a little bit of history, particularly before we hear from our neighborhood friends, about some big buckets of changes that have happened along the way to help us remind us of where we've come.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you. Mayor, Councilmember Willits, thank you for that. And thank you for highlighting it, because I did kind of hit on it some in my presentation, but it's an important piece to pull out and actually discuss and highlight, because it's a way in which the community very much had a role in shaping the basics of this ordinance. So last spring, there was a series of public meetings that went on in Boise. Council participated in many of them. But when the first draft of what was called modules 1 and 2 were presented, so modules 1 and 2, or phases 1 and 2 of the ordinance, had to do with the zoning districts themselves. What would be these zones that we would create in the city, these new zones, and then what would the regulations, the design standards around those zones be? So the first draft of those first 2 modules happened in the winter of 2021 and then the spring of 2022. And there was a lot of animosity and resistance to them. Others can characterize it, but we were kind of stuck at that time because there was so much resistance to the basic proposals within the ordinance. And honestly, I would characterize it a little bit as the ordinance was drafted as kind of an implementation of theories. You know, that's kind of what we were presenting in modules 1 and 2 was here's a theory about how we could change the city. It was not specific to this city. And people may not have expressed it that way, but they really responded negatively to the point where it was a question, is this even how are we going to deal with this? So Councilmember Willits, the big changes I would note.
And I guess I'm just going to jump in here. Would this get to, because you and I had those conversations at that point, would this get to what you'd said a little bit earlier? This isn't a zoning code that's with a one headline. Like it's not.
So.
Is that really what
Yeah,
you're?
that's,
I
thank
mean,
you
you
for
should go into
telling me to get to the point.
Continue, but you'd said that earlier and I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you about it because you can't really use one headline because it's more tailored now.
Right.
Okay. All right.
And the
I
one
just wanted
headline
to,
thing
and then
had to
please
do
jump
with-
back in. Sorry to interrupt you.
The reason I mentioned the one headline, this isn't unique to Boise, but in Boise's case last summer, it was let's go from two units on any individual lot to 4 units on any individual lot. And remember at that time, Councilmember Willits, we were proposing to consolidate the single family zones. The R1 districts, we've got 3 of them. At the time, we were saying, let's make it 2. Let's get rid of the largest lot of the single family. Let's make it 2. And then on any of those, you can just do 4 units. That was the one headline of the ordinance. Don't pay any attention to the rest of this, which has nothing to do with Boise. It was just this one headline and this one solution to all these problems we have. Let's put all of our problems on the backs of this one decision we might make. Well, that didn't make sense to people. And there was a lot of concern about it. Concern is a very friendly term in light of what was happening at those public meetings. You'll remember this. So the shift that was made was the issue of the incentives, number one. Okay, let's keep the 3 R1 districts. We're not going to eliminate one of the R1 districts. We're going to keep all 3. We got a unique set of neighborhoods in the city. Let's acknowledge that and keep all 3. Number 2, and again, this was very much, you'll remember these hearings where this was discussed so much. How is it helpful to us if on a single family lot in a neighborhood somewhere in the city, you get 2 additional units and they're very expensive, large houses? How is that helping us address these affordability goals that we have as a city? Good point. So we created the incentives around this. Are the incentives perfect? We think they're really a really good start. I suspect the city over years will continue to work on them, but we created the incentives, kept the R1 districts, and built that additional units through the incentive program. We created the strategic infill. We were hearing a lot about this ordinance encouraging the demolition of existing structures and the fact that if you're in a neighborhood, you don't know where the density is going to be. It could be anywhere. And so we created the strategic infill to say, let's not encourage the demolition of structures, and let's acknowledge that within every neighborhood of the city, we have busier streets and we have less busy streets. I mean, that's a natural condition in any city. So on a busier street, you can do some more units. This is not a highway. This is a street everybody walks and rides their bike down. It's just that it's one of the main streets in a neighborhood. So let's allow the additional density there. That was a change that happened last summer. And last summer, importantly, these mixed use districts were created that we didn't even have them. We had one blanket mixed use. So the whole city was covered in mixed use with no differentiation of what one street, how it's different than another, or what were the goals we were seeking to achieve in terms of where density went. So that was a big change last summer, Councilmember Willits. And so the basic structure of this ordinance came out of the public process. And I'll have to be honest with you, when we started discussing this last summer at the libraries and so forth, there was a tremendous amount of relief that we were proposing an ordinance, or we were moving towards an ordinance that reflected this city and not just theories and not one headline. So last summer was a period of a lot of satisfaction. Might be, hey, it's zoning. Maybe satisfaction is the wrong term, But it was when we got into process, that again, we ran into, a lot of different opinions about things, which is understandable and all that. But that's why I think modules 1 and 2 were so important, because if we get the structure right and we understand what we want as a city, how growth and develop, we're going to grow, we're going to develop, we're going to change. Sorry, we can't decide not to do those things. No city can. So acknowledging that, let's shape it in a way that it addresses these big issues, and therefore then let's make it as easy as possible to do. But Councilmember Willits, those were big changes. That was fundamental changes that came from that first round of public hearings related to modules 1 and 2, such that we shifted entirely last summer as a result of that feedback.
All right, thank you very much. I think we've got time for a couple, probably 1 or 2 neighborhood associations. We're planning on breaking around 5:30 to 6 like we normally do. I think we might be able to fit 1 or 2 in. I'll just have to see how many questions and what the discussion looks like. We'll start. I'm just going to go alphabetically, and there might be an extra sheet out there. And so I'll make sure before I move from Bs to Cs, et cetera, that there's no other Bs here. Rob Stark. And after all that time discussing the time for neighborhood associations, I made sure that everybody knew in advance that neighborhood associations had 5 minutes tonight. So you don't get the same amount of time as Tim. No.
So you guys are all rested, you're hydrated, maybe got a flask under the desk, you're buckled in for this. Rob Stark, Vice President, Barber Valley Neighborhood Association, 6865 East Warm Springs. Madam Mayor, council members, BVNA agrees that the zoning code is long due for an update. 57 years, best practices and community needs and lifestyles have changed significantly. BVNA wants to make sure that the city has adequate resources to revisit, adapt, and evolve the new code when unintended consequences, errors, and better practices arise. Make the process to identify and make amendments easily executed without a huge impact on the staff. With full transparency to the public. In BVNA's experience, it's not been easy to amend SPO1 as circumstances and best practices change. We'd suggest that the new code should be automatically reviewed and amended on a timetable. Our biggest concerns relate to communications between the city and the NAs and citizens. We're disappointed that the proposed time for NAs to speak at public hearings is being reduced. We believe that NAs should continue to have the same amount of time as the applicant to address P&Z and council. Many applications and issues are complicated and need time to be properly addressed. Boise has a diverse set of neighborhoods, and the neighborhood associations have vital knowledge about their neighborhood that's next to impossible for commissioners and council to always be aware of. In that same vein, we want to make sure residents continue to have sufficient time and opportunity to voice their positions on applications. We're deeply concerned about expanding administrative approvals without communication by the city to the public. This lack of transparency is worrisome. We understand NAs will still continue to be notified about applications, but there needs to be outreach not just to the NAs, but to nearby residents as well for all applications, and pre-application meetings should still be required. BVNA has serious concerns about applications getting approved without any chance for neighborhood association or resident input. We have seen positive changes made in proposals after the neighborhood input at a pre-app meeting. BVNA would suggest that at least applications that are designed for administrative approval require some form of consultation with the appropriate neighborhood association. The real rub is that to appeal an administrative approval, the appellant will be required to pay a fee to file an appeal for something they never had a chance to oppose before the approval. We believe on administrative approvals, the neighborhood associations should have an avenue to ask the city for reconsideration without having to file a full-blown appeal. Neighbors should have an opportunity for their voices to be heard. Finally, we believe that when council gives direction to an applicant, those directions mean nothing unless it's in the motion. At times, there's no serious follow-through on directions by staff or applicants until it's too late, in effect, kicking the can down the road. We would suggest that council directions not only need to be in motions, but need to be tied to permits instead of final plats. Final plat stage is too late of a deadline as construction commences before the hearing. Our neighborhood has been negatively impacted in the past on multiple applications because no one followed up on direction until it was too late, and the developer had already proceeded too far to comply. Directions and expectations need to be in the form of written conditions of approval that can be accomplished early in the process. Thanks for your time and consideration. We understand this is a complicated project and you're going to be hearing a lot of other voices and are thankful for the opportunity to address the council.
Madam Mayor, I just have a question for Rob. Thanks for being here tonight.
Mhm.
And I'm going to actually ask this of all the neighborhood associations as everyone comes up. What did your neighborhood association process look like in developing your stance and recommendations on the zoning code?
Well, there was the core few of us that kicked it around the most. And then at our executive work session with the whole board, then we discussed those points, took further input, and then voted on other things on what we wanted to concentrate on. Because things did get brought up about parking, about loss of naturally occurring affordable housing. We've got 10 people on our board, so there's 10 different viewpoints. But as a board, we were able to decide that concentrating on the communication portion of it was the most important thing. And we also felt strongly that because it seems like there's a lot of knee jerk on a lot of stuff and throw the whole thing out and start over. And we didn't agree with that. But we want the process because things are going to be wrong in this. I mean, it's too big, 600 pages, something's not going to be right, unintended consequences. And that's the biggest thing is we wanted to make sure that those errors can be changed as easily as possible without any further pain.
Madam Mayor, I have a follow-up. So you mentioned a 10-person board. Was it mostly you all, or did you do a broader community outreach to Barber Valley?
It was pretty much the board.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for being here and kicking us off. You know, it's not always easy to be the person who goes first. So
But
it's-
now he gets to go home if he wants to.
yeah, no, you get to go home. If you want to, we'll see. So question, I think on some of the timing thing, because I think that there's an intention with the proposal to make sure that there's a guaranteed amount of time for the neighborhood associations, which was maybe expressed throughout this process. What I heard you just say is that you don't think that there should be a guaranteed amount of time, and it should be tied to the amount of time that the presenter or the applicant gets. And I just want to make sure that that's what you think and meant to say.
Yeah, every application is different. I mean, there's been some applications we've spoken on where 2 minutes is plenty. There's been times where one of us spent over 10 minutes talking on complicated applications. And it's 5 minutes is just kind of scary on some of the ones that we've dealt with. Most of the time, yeah, it would be fine. But
Yeah, Madam Mayor, I'm
It's-
going to change my question just a little bit. So what I'm trying to figure out is, do you want more guaranteed time, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it might be, or do you just want the same way that it is now, the same amount of time as the applicant?
continue the way it is now.
Okay, thank you.
I've got a question for you, actually. So you mentioned a suggestion that we create a review and amend process. Are you thinking in that, I mean, Tim talked about the performance review and the dashboard that would be there. So we could, because we do, we're iterating as we go along. We're looking at this code, but there will likely be changes that need to be made. So he proposed a performance dashboard, wondering if you think that meets it. Then I had another question about the expected amendment process or review process. Do you see that as something that would just become rote, that every year everybody knows there's a time at which the conversation would be had about amendments, or that it should be triggered by a request or something else? I'm just wondering if you can flesh that out a little bit more.
As far as it should be a timetable, whether that's a year and a half, 2 years. It might have to be a year at first, since it all is so new and there's going to be so much stuff. And then after that, it gets spread out. But with SPO1, it always seemed like something had to be triggered. There had to be an application for an amendment to be made to SPO1. And that kind of puts an onus on waiting for the right application, because we can see things that should be changed in the in SPO one, even since SPO one was passed, so much best practices have changed. Even as far as, say, biking, bike lanes and bike paths, and there needs to be an easier process to keep things up to date, so it's not 57 years from now that we've got to do a whole nother 600-page document. The first question, I don't really have a good answer for that one.
Madam Mayor, I have a question for you too, Robin. It's like the council president, it's not directed at you. It's probably going to be for most of the neighborhood associations, because this time issue is one that I've really struggled with. And it seems like, kind of a procedural detail, but it's not, it's a big deal. And so without characterizing any neighborhood association, and certainly not your own, here's a couple of issues I see. One is the difficulty in getting people to serve in a neighborhood association and the relatively low amount of turnover. It has such a potential to create a neighborhood association that's really a small group of people who've been doing it for a long time. So you can have decisions that are made by a neighborhood association that are really made by a couple of people, maybe one or two or three really passionate, maybe one charismatic person and a few other people who want to help. That doesn't necessarily represent the neighborhood. We have some neighborhoods, for instance, with an incredibly high population of renters, no renter involvement on the neighborhood association board. As you can imagine, sometimes the views of longtime established homeowners actually differ from the views of renters, even though renters in fact make up half or the majority of the neighborhood. So there's this structural problem there. And it's a structural problem that goes to the point of view being represented by the neighborhood association. It may not actually be the point of view of the neighborhood. Sometimes it is, but there's a potential that it can't be. The second issue is that it's been my experience that when the neighborhood is unified and feels strongly, it turns out anyway. The amount of time that we hear from neighbors in the allotted testimony time greatly exceeds 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes on these applications. And so I have this sense that when the neighborhood is unified and there is a neighborhood point of view that the neighborhood feels strongly about, it comes to us without regard to the neighborhood association. However, when the neighborhood does not have a unified point of view or does not feel strongly, it comes to us very strongly from the neighborhood association. And so the issue that I'm grappling with is when the neighborhood really does have a position, we get it without regard to neighborhood association time. When the neighborhood doesn't have a position, we often get one that's characterized as the neighborhood position when it's not, because we've guaranteed this time to the small group of people who are willing to do, that hard work of being on the neighborhood association board. I don't have an answer to that, but how should I grapple with it and what conclusion should I come to?
I think that adds to the point of making sure that the residents are notified of these applications, so they have an opportunity. Because as a neighborhood association, we struggle with it. We put stuff out there and we don't get a lot of feedback from people. We have a huge email list. Hardly anybody comes to the meetings unless it's about the new elementary school, and then we have more people than we have room for in the room. But if the residents don't have an opportunity to find out about an application that's potentially contentious, then how are they going to have a chance in mass to respond to you, the elected officials?
So if I could follow up, then tell me what you think about this solution. No or very small neighborhood association testimony time, but rigorous noticing to the residents, so that if the residents do have an opinion, they'll come. If they don't have an opinion, we don't have a neighborhood association representing that there's an opinion when in fact there's not one.
So you put me on the spot.
Yeah, and
You
this is
grapple-
really
grapple
hard.
with something and-
We've all been thinking hard about this for a couple of years, and it's not. I wanted to ask these questions, and I'll ask them of multiple neighborhood associations because they're really hard. And I'm struggling to figure out the right answer.
So me standing up here on my own without consulting with any of my board mates, it sounds like a fair trade-off. Because that's what we're struggling with is the neighbors aren't getting notified on as much stuff. The amount of time that the neighborhood association can speak to respond to things. And it just sounds like, whether it's true or not, it feels like, it appears like to many of us that the citizens' voices are kind of being quashed a little bit. And it's, some people have the impression that we know better than you. We can make these decisions. We don't need your input. You can vote us out, if you want. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but that is an impression that, and you're going to hear that this week. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of people that, and the people that just want to throw the whole thing out. But that's the point that we're trying to make, is there needs to still be the opportunity for not just the neighborhood association, but the residents, their voices to be heard, whether it's to the P&Z Commission or to council here.
Thank you. I appreciate you helping me stagger through that. It's challenging, and I'll be asking other neighborhood associations the same question. I really appreciate it, Rob. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, are you glad you went first?
Oh, yeah. I was disappointed at commission that they saved questions for the end, so I had to stick around.
So I just kind of want to echo that I think that some of these questions are going to come up again and again for neighborhood associations. And just to make sure that people are prepared, it sounds like there's going to be question about like what your outreach was on this particular one. There's going to be questions about like, what do you think the appropriate amount of time a notification is based off of what's proposed right now. So I would just maybe relay to other neighborhood associations that are coming up. Those are going to be questions that are going to be asked. So if you're proactive about it, you might not be under the gun quite as much as you were, Rob, but good job.
Well, I can say that we did put the news out there just as much as, the city puts the email blast. We put this out there in our meetings, in our email blasts, encouraging people to get involved. We didn't get much feedback. So that's where it, and even amongst the board, I mean, those of you that have served on neighborhood associations know that not everybody's involved as everybody else. And that's kind of where things.
And
So
then
it
Mayor, just to
is.
be clear, like the goal here is to make sure that we're getting public involvement right, because I think we all want to make sure that that's done really, really effectively, and trying to figure out the balance between outreach, between time, between notification is where we're trying to get. And so that's where the questions come from. Certainly not an attack or accusation on, certain ways, but really trying to figure out like, what is the way that we're going to make the public involvement the best and most effective that can possibly be, while also achieving the goals that, that we have for the city.
And we appreciate that, and that you are considering that. And
Madam Mayor, I just have a quick comment for Rob. Thanks for going first, Rob. Really appreciate it. Also, translation for anyone who doesn't know what SPO1 is, it's the Harris Ranch Specific Plan that was approved by this body in the 80s, I believe.
90s.
90s. It started in the 80s and then it was finally approved in the
Some of us
90s.
went through that.
So that's what SPO1 is. Thanks for getting up here, Rob. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. We will go ahead now. We go to break? No? I'm getting a no and a yes. Oh, yep. We're going to go ahead and take a break now, and we'll be back at 6:10. All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. Let me see. For those of you that might have come while we were on break, I said we're doing neighborhood associations alphabetically. There's a sheet out there. So if some of you signed up on that, I'll make sure before we move on to another letter that you've had your chance. And with that, we're going to go to Boise Heights. Jeff Faraday, welcome.
Madam Mayor, City Council, I'm Jeff Faraday. I live at 420 East Crestline Drive, Boise, and I'm representing today the Boise Heights Neighborhood Association. Tonight, I'm going to offer some testimony really to supplement the testimony that we've given before and our written comments that we submitted on several subjects, about 5 subjects. This really just deals with one. The basic issue that I want to talk about are pedestrian access and trail connections. Our position is that trails and pedestrian access should be considered part of essential infrastructure when a subdivision is constructed, particularly in the foothills. And we've provided comments, and I provide another copy tonight, slightly amended from the earlier version, that suggests language in 2 areas of the code rewrite. We think that it's important to establish these trail connections at the outset so that home buyers and the neighborhood can all understand where these access corridors are and begin using them right away. Here's our neighborhood's experience. 2 points. The first point relates to our Exhibit A, which has been provided to you. You've probably seen this map before, which has a schematic trail drawn on it in the bowl area, which is well known in our neighborhood in Boise Heights. That map relates to condition 13 in CUP 99-00065 for Somerset 2, which mandates public access between Hulls Gulch, Boise Hills Park, which is at the bottom of that bowl on Pleasant Hill Way, and Military Reserve Park. We have proposed an alignment of that trail. For many years, we've asserted this alignment, and for many years, nothing has happened. That CUP was granted in 1999. That's 24 years ago, no trail. One generation of children has grown up in this neighborhood and moved away, and the trail is still not there. It was a trail that, if built, could have provided a lot of safety for our neighborhood, where they could avoid walking up parts of our streets, especially with all the activity in our neighborhood with regard to service vehicles and remodel vehicles and so forth. City staff, especially Parks, has met with us several times about this trail. And they've been very helpful and sympathetic, but nothing has happened with regard to this old CUP requirement. Our fear is that this requirement, and we fear it's the same fate as other requirements in CUPs, will just be forgotten, just fade away. People will die, people will move away, the condition will be ignored and ultimately never implemented. That's not the way the city is supposed to work. The second point relates to our Exhibit B, which really is just an illustration for you. Exhibit B simply illustrates what we see as a developer resistance to providing public access pathways in some cases. The passageway shown in that exhibit for public access was what the developer negotiated in the Somerset Village development on Boise Hills Drive. It is essentially unusable. And if the city tries to deliver wow, this was a wow, followed by really? This is not a public access corridor squeezed between 2 houses with landscape covering it up and no invitation whatsoever for the public. So that is our position on trail access. We think it needs to be taken very seriously and implemented just like sidewalks are implemented and put in at the outset of these developments. So thank you very much for your time. And I'll stand for your inevitable questions.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. I have a couple. This is actually the second time we've heard this particular point tonight about conditions not ever being implemented in the development process. Have you put any thought into when or where we could put those conditions so that they are actually implemented?
Madam Mayor, Councilwoman Woodings, yes, I have. And I certainly don't have proposed language for any CUP condition anywhere in the that might appear under any subject in the code. But what I've done here, what our board has approved here are conditions in this in these comments that I submitted, which I give specific language for how it will be implemented at the outset. So you can take a look at those. But that's what I would suggest, is that if the CUP condition says something has to happen, the city should be thinking this should happen as soon as possible, instead of just being, well, it's out there. Well, developer may not finish building this out for 37 years. And then may decide, like in our case, in the last phase, over which there was controversy and developer did not get his way, he's just going to sit on it, maybe for his next generation to take up. That's not fair to the neighbors. It's not fair to the process. And we think it's a recipe for having that kind of a condition simply fall through the cracks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. And then my second question is, how many folks were involved in your neighborhood association recommendations in creating those? Was it just the board? Was it a broader neighborhood effort? What did that look like?
Councilwoman Woodings, I would say it's somewhere in between. It was certainly the board, but the board presented this at more than one neighborhood-wide meeting, for which we have pretty good attendance and which we advertise and send emails out for, and set up a reader board at the entrance to our neighborhood to encourage attendance and so forth. And we've had, in late May, we just had another meeting on this very subject where we had some 35 people there, neighborhood members, talking about this very subject.
Great.
So we try to reach out as far as we can every time. We have a neighborhood newsletter that goes out. We have quarterly board meetings. We sometimes do lit drops to every house in the neighborhood. And that's how we try to keep the neighbors involved.
Great. Thank you so much.
We invite musicians to our annual meetings, and we have free refreshments.
Madam Mayor, when I was on the North End Neighborhood Association, we had ice cream at ours, and it works. Refreshments work.
Madam Mayor, first of all, thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for advocating for trail access and for something very specific that you found that you want us to address. That's always appreciated to be able to look and kind of find some of those things. I'm just going to assume that you are okay with 5 minutes of testimony time, and I'm going to assume the other neighborhood associations, unless they say something different, are fine with the 5 minutes of guaranteed testimony time.
That would be an expansive assumption if I'm responding, because I think 5 minutes is inadequate. I think maybe twice that might be more adequate. I recognize that this is a difficult issue, and it's ultimately not helpful to anybody to have a lot of repetition through a lot of testifiers and so forth. But the public does need to be heard. And if a applicant has 30 minutes, 40 minutes, or whatever it might be, plus rebuttal time, which is often the case, then I don't think it's fair to say, to at least to a neighborhood association, you only have 5 minutes.
Madam Mayor, so I've got you on the record for saying that you'd like at least 10 minutes.
Councilman Halliburton, that's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other Bs? Okay, move into the Cs. I've got Joni. Is it Fauci? I should know this, but welcome.
Hi, thank you, Mayor. Before I do my comments here, I would say, I used to say it Fosse. A person I now refer to as Uncle Tony calls it Fauci. So either way, it's fine. Thank you, Mayor and council members, for hearing these comments. My name is Joni Fosse, 2944 Hillway Drive, Boise. While not currently on the board, I have been asked by the board of the Central Foothills Neighborhood Association to comment on their behalf. We want to thank the staff for all the outreach meetings they've had, even through a pandemic. I have been following the zoning code rewrite since the beginning. I've attended meetings and commented at each phase. I learned a lot during the community conversation meetings and most recently at the planning and zoning meetings. The residents of our city have a variety of opinions. I too have modified my opinions on this rewrite throughout the process. I used to be concerned about the limited parking requirements, but no longer, especially after hearing from a developer how much more rent they have to charge to provide more parking. We don't need higher rents. I also talked to a new friend about parking in her apartment complex. She says she rarely goes to the parking garage for her car, maybe once a week. She mostly uses one of her bicycles to get around town. She needs more bicycle parking, not car parking. And I heard many other young people testify similarly at the planning and zoning hearings. I do hope all future apartment or condo complexes have covered, secured bicycle and scooter parking with charging access of at least one space per bedroom, as well as electric vehicle charging stations for the modern car. And hopefully we will have better mass transit system in the future. I used to be concerned about duplexes and quadplexes, but then I looked around the north, east, and west end neighborhoods. They're tucked in everywhere, and everyone is getting along just fine. Some people even testified that the plexes have more hurdles to jump through for approvals, and that thus resulted in more neighborly development than some mega single-family residents that take up the entire lot and tower over the neighboring houses. So I think we should be allowing the plexes and other smaller housing options with building restrictions to be built. I used to be concerned about the public involvement process, but I'm over that now too. What I'm not over and still have concerns with are, 1, mandates versus incentives. I've been told that the code cannot have mandates. That's just too bad because we should be mandating affordable housing and energy efficiency or sustainability improvements. 2, a way to say no and the by right allowance. Too often I've seen the city approve a development proposal because code allowed it, and there was fear of being sued. I wish the city had a way out, a way to just say no. Not every development should go forward. 3, development agreements, variances, waivers. This area is where the public feels uneducated and out of the process. It's a gray area and likely always will be, unfortunately. 4, code enforcement compliance. The new zoning code is probably not the place for a staffing goal, but we do need more code and compliance enforcement staff and the ability for them to levy fines or other violation punishments. We, being in the WUI overlay zone, are mostly concerned with firewise vegetation and outside lighting. Through this process, we have also become aware of CUP amenities that never get fulfilled. This is especially a problem in multi-phase developments. CUP amenities and infrastructure improvements should be required to be completed at the beginning of projects, not at the end. Some examples are fire stations, trail access, and playgrounds with bathrooms and no goat heads. The code compliance areas could fulfill where the CUP stuff gets looked into. Then things we really do like in the draft new zoning code. 1, the WUI vegetation requirements. This totally affects our livability. We are so vulnerable to wildfire rather. It It worries us daily. Thanks for putting these requirements and the WUI overlay in the code. Water quality, quantity, and energy efficiency. This is our future. We need to be conservative with all of this. Pedestrian, bicycle, and mass transit. This will help all of us with better air quality, better exercise and health, and just better living. This past winter, the news group Boise Dev surveyed Boise neighborhood associations for their comments on the zoning rewrite. Hopefully the mayor and council saw the article. We would like to express our support of the points made by Boise Heights, Centennial, Collister, North End, West End, and West Valley neighborhood associations.
Time.
We also agree with the neighbors for Boise.
Thank you.
Okay, I agree, and I think even though we have some concerns, the zoning code should be approved.
Thank you. You might have a question or two. I think you're going to have the usuals.
Okay, do you want me to just answer some?
Yeah, you had said that you are here on behalf of Central Foothills, so I'm
Right.
hoping that you know the answer to my question, which you
So
already
the
know what it
board
is.
supports these comments.
Okay.
They haven't asked the general membership at large. We've had a huge issue with involvement of the neighborhood. You know, it's just really hard to get anybody to be involved in anything.
And how large is the board of Central Foothills?
8.
8. Great. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
I would say 10 minutes for the testimony at the minimum.
All right, you barely made it on. I'm really expect people to answer during their time if it's a concern. So thank you.
Oh, because otherwise you won't answer it. Ask it. Okay, great. Anything else? All righty. Any other Cs? We're going to move then to Depot Bench. Jim Pickett.
Maybe I could project something at some point in time.
You have it on a flash. Oh.
With a projector? No, we don't.
I thought Wi-Fi could scan it in. Right,
Yeah.
old school, sorry.
We can pass it up and down here if you want while you're
It was in
talking.
the comments.
Yeah.
But it wasn't in our comments, so I'm stealing.
Okay.
So see. Maybe. All right. My name is Jim Pickett, 3501 Windsor Drive. I'm the treasurer of the Depot Bench Neighbors Association, been involved with the neighborhood
Okay.
for 15 years. 10 minutes would be a fine time. In the past, we've had as much as 15. So I'm going to be constrained by 5. Madam Mayor, Council Chair, and Council members, thank you for the opportunity to present to you this evening our comments on the proposed zoning code. And thank you to planning and zoning staff for coming out under short notice on May 22nd to have a neighborhood association meeting with us. These comments largely come from that meeting where we had in excess of 50 people attend. Opinions during that meeting were as broad as you would expect. We have some people adamantly for the zoning code as it is written, and some people who are against the zoning code. So I am presenting tonight the comments, the concerns that people have, and threefold: reduction in public comment, lack of notification, and height concerns along Vista. So I've testified here many times. While we feel we're always heard, sometimes I've swayed decisions, but very few. But we feel like we were always heard. So a step backwards in the public involvement process concerns us. The type 2 projects that Director Keene talked about, we feel those are important. We need to be able to have our say, and not every neighborhood association is involved. There needs to be public notification, because you can't rely on the neighborhood associations to have public input, because those neighborhood associations, as much as we publicize them on the Energize site, there just aren't people being a conduit of information downstream from the city. So there needs to be some way to have the general public know about projects and comment on them. The project tracker is a great idea, but I know that it's hard to believe not everybody's excited about planning and zoning. And and it's not top of mind awareness for everyone to go, I'm going to go look at the website today and see if there's any new projects. They find out about a project when there's yellow iron in a lot next to them. So the steps that you've taken in the zone, the R2, R3, MX1, and MX2 are a great step forward, but the 60% AMI seems way too low. That'll never be exceeded. And there's no topic, no detail of how big an area that will that needs to be in that 60% AMI. Lack of notification in general. The people that are the lots that are moving from R1C to R2, I have two people right here sitting next to me. If it wasn't for our neighborhood meeting, they would not know that they were being rezoned, that their properties were being rezoned. The city has done a great job of outreach. A postcard to these people, letting them know that their property is going to be rezoned would have been a great step forward. There are 250 at our estimate, 250 properties along the Vista corridor that have been designated from R1C to, they'll move from R1C to R2. Those people don't know about it. They've not been informed. Finally, we have height concerns around the MX3 zone of 70 feet. The flyer, the diagram I passed along, many of the properties, I think Vista is unique. There are many properties along the MX3 zone, along Vista, that have been incorporated into, that will be upzoned. I hate to use that word. They'll be rezoned to R2 that are going to be right next to commercial. And they'll be right next to that M3 zone. And there is no transition between that M3s, the C2 zone and that MX3 zone. So you're going to have this bungalow next to this 70-foot building. And then you're going to have a 2 or 3 story building next to it. And these houses are going to be surrounded much like the houses that are the old houses along the street. I can't think of it now. It's right down on like 5th and Broad. Those old houses are just going to be surrounded by large buildings. So I share that scale drawing with you. And I'll close with equitability. Vista, the bench, I believe, is being targeted, not targeted, but is not.
Time.
There is a large percentage of the houses along Vista that are being rezoned, and we feel like it's a higher percentage than anywhere else in the city. There's Park Center could have been MX3. There's other areas of the city that could have been included in MX3, and they just weren't. I'm at time. Thank you very much for your time listening to our concerns. We agree that the planning and zoning code needs to be rewritten, and but we feel that there's still some work to be done.
Jim, thank you.
Thank you.
Very
I'll
much.
stand for any questions.
Madam Mayor, there's a variety of different things that can be built in sort of these type 2 approvals. Is there anything specifically in there that's more concerning than others, or is it just sort of in general?
I think it's the height along Vista, if that's what you're asking. I think it's the 70-foot height. Is, currently I know that in a
So actually what I'm talking about is that there's a notification that you asked for you wanted to have notification for type 2 approvals.
I would say anything that was multifamily.
Okay.
Madam Mayor, Jim already answered my question in his testimony. Thanks, Jim.
Mhm.
Madam Mayor, I think I kind of know your point, but you can make sure I have it right. It looks like everybody's going to be asked for a review on neighborhood association time, but what I took from your testimony was less important to you than that is that the people in your neighborhood are notified and have an opportunity to participate if they want to. So it's not so much about the neighborhood association as it is about the actual human beings who live in your neighborhood being included.
Councilman Badgett, I would agree with that. I think there needs to be a way for people to know what's going on in their neighborhood.
Excellent.
And if they have if it's an issue that they feel strongly about, as you know, they will come out.
They do. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you again for your time and listening.
Sorry. Next up, we've got Bruce Masterovich with Downtown Boise.
Right. Thank you, Mayor and Council members, for the opportunity to speak on behalf of Boise's Downtown Neighborhood Association, which you're calling Boise DNA. My name is Bruce Mastorovich. I live at 450 West Grove Street, and I'm working with a small but great group of people to reboot the Downtown Neighborhood Association. We had our first publicly advertised meeting on June 1st. Most people found out by word of mouth, but we reached a few people by flyers. Sorry to anybody that missed these. We had some bad luck with rain, and we're learning a bit about where we're actually allowed to post. We're new to this. We had a great discussion on June 1st. We mostly talked about the roles of neighborhood associations in Boise, ways to get involved in future meetings, and ideas for a mission statement, and then kind of wrapped up on the zoning code at the end. We had an otherwise full agenda and just focused on big picture highlights for the code update. Everybody in attendance pretty much agreed that we weren't really ready to take an official stance until we do more outreach. So another popular opinion we heard, though, is just that we should still get up and just say that we're here. Good way to let people know. I know there's a lot of really engaged people watching these meetings. I think downtown, and I think you guys have touched on this a little bit, but maybe a few other neighborhoods have a difficult time kind of building that long-term core of people that really fuel keeping a neighborhood association going. We're a neighborhood of people that mostly don't own their homes. However, we're still passionate about our community. And like I said, we're here. I think we're going to have some opportunities to kind of build a more sustainable neighborhood association going forward. Recently, we've grown from a neighborhood that was predominantly for business to kind of more of that mixed use that we're talking about. So we have more people living there now. So if a few move out, I think we can kind of weather that storm. Yeah, I feel like a lot of this is already touched on, but yeah, we're not going to take a position on this today. We're just mostly here saying we're here, trying to get more people to join in. We have a website at boisedna.org. We'll have our next meeting probably like late July or early August, and probably be like a park picnic. So, and I have no idea on what an appropriate amount of time is. Yeah.
Thank you. And Bruce asked me earlier as we went to take a break, if tomorrow at the hearing, we would have, if we'd be taking folks sooner that needed to leave for night shift. The answer is yes. And I'll also be asking at the beginning of hearings if there are folks that need to be accommodated time-wise, just to let people know. And I appreciate that you had asked me that earlier. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thanks.
There are no other Ds. Okay. Next, we have South Cole Neighborhood Association, Esty LaFriends. Oh, I didn't ask, do we have anybody before S? So Glenwoods, then there's a couple H's, L's, M's, N's, P's.
Madam Mayor, we have some online if you'd like.
Oh, great. Yeah, you can raise your hand online. I'll take you first. Sorry, Esty, I just forgot. If it's one of those letters.
I'm not sure if I am here. Looks like it because I'm getting a response on the.
Richard, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Richard Llewellyn, 9170 Hill Road, representing Northwest Neighborhood Association. First of all, we need 10 minutes at a minimum for our neighborhood associations. We've all heard that the best chance to uphold the policies of Blueprint Boise is to amend the zoning code to do so. And Blueprint Boise isn't just about housing. It's also about livability, quality of life, protecting nature and open spaces close to home. With one exception, codifying the multimodal pathway along State Street, this rewrite ignores the specific livability goals and policies for Northwest Boise. For example, our neighborhood plan has an action goal of creating a north-south pathway between Bogart and Duncan Lane along irrigation lateral number 34. We've started it on the north and the south, but when and if the other properties develop, there needs to be a requirement for its connection. Otherwise, it won't happen. And this is not in the zoning code rewrite, but it should be. We also have a number of policies on improving the water quality and habitat of our year-round waterway, the Spoils Bank Canal. This is the most important drain within Boise that flows into the Boise River. It has its own native rainbow trout population, which require cold and clean water. Just this morning, I heard on local radio that Boise Public Works is attempting to meet our wastewater discharge standards into the river by planting trees and deepening channels. But if we keep cutting down trees along the Spoils Bank Canal and piping the ditches and paving over the farmland that recharges our traditional shallow aquifer, we are working against that goal. And policies of our neighborhood plan and policies of Blueprint Boise. These trees that shade the Spoils Bank Canal and the laterals and the canals are typically native willows and cottonwood that are not protected by ordinance outside of the narrow ribbon along the Boise River. It is important to remember that not very long ago, all of this area was occasionally flooded by a more natural river, and these canals and ditches and laterals are a vestige, a network of the dynamic river that provided our area so many benefits. Unfortunately, the zoning code rewrite, while I will agree with Tim Keene that it does speak to foothills, especially, and that's great, very important. And to some extent, not as well, but to the Boise River, to some extent to the desert to the south. What it really ignores is the traditional small farming landscape that is essential for many things. And as I'm speaking here to groundwater recharge, as well as combating the urban heat island, it really is almost entirely blind to that. And that's unfortunate and needs to be rectified. Like I was saying, part of that is groundwater recharge. Boise Blueprint and our neighborhood plan have policies to protect recharge. But unfortunately, the adequate water ordinance will result in targeting irrigated farmland for development. And that again is the main source of recharge of our traditional aquifer. And I think it's important that City of Boise realize that more than 5,000 residential parcels within the city are not hooked up to Veolia, corporate water, but rely on the traditional aquifer, which is typically a shallow aquifer, for drinking water. So Boise, along with Reno and Las Vegas, have been identified as the worst cities in the United States for increasing the urban heat island. And this is palpable in our neighborhood. Every time a farmland is paved over, you can feel it. You ride your bicycle by at nighttime, and instead of that nice, refreshing, cool air, it's now hot. And again, the traditional shallow aquifer supports native trees and feral trees that are sometimes a nuisance, like black locust. But these provide much of the cooling that combats the urban heat island. We get rid of the recharge, those trees will no longer survive. It's super critical for any kind of modern zoning code to deal with this very modern problem that we're feeling every day and using more energy for air conditioning to overcome. It's a loop. It's a complicated system of groundwater recharge that needs to be protected, and we're not doing it in this code. In general, we are not supporting neighborhood plans, and neighborhood plans are part of Blueprint Boise, of course. Our neighborhood plan was adopted into Blueprint Boise just in 2020. And so we have a lot of concerns that we've put forth, put a lot of time into that. We really need to see our neighborhood plan, but across Boise, all of those neighborhoods that have plans, make sure that those policies and goals and action items are addressed in the rewrite. Because currently, upon a rezone of an individual parcel, at least we have an opportunity to uphold those policies with a development agreement. We can say, yes, you can rezone for more density, but you need to implement these policies of the neighborhood plan, comprehensive plan.
Richard.
Yes.
Thank you. You were kind of a bit ago.
Okay.
Any questions for Richard?
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us tonight. I heard you talk about a pathway along Spoils Bank. Is that pathway one of the pathways that's delineated in the master plan?
So I was speaking about a different pathway, but they are related. I was speaking about the one that's in our neighborhood plan, and that connects State Street and Hill Road. And it would cross the pathway that you're speaking of along the Spoils Bank Canal, which is in the master pathways. The one along the lateral is a traditional pathway. I had a best friend down on State Street and used to walk along it, you know, to visit him when I was a kid. That's not in the zoning code rewrite or the master pathways plan.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then my next question is around Northwest Neighborhood Association's outreach and public or neighborhood involvement on your comments. Can you tell me how that went?
Sure. Yeah, we struggled with that in part because our board is number of illnesses and overworked. What we decided was best thing to do is stick to how the zoning code rewrite affects our neighborhood plan. And that's our default in general, you know, because we spent those 2 years to write our neighborhood plan, had hundreds of people. We were graded as a, you know, super overachieving neighborhood with our neighborhood plan. We just default to how a development impacts negatively or positively the neighborhood plan. That's what I attempted to stick to here.
All right, great. And yes, I do remember that you all were overachievers on your public involvement with that neighborhood plan. Thanks for the reminder, and thanks for being here tonight, Richard.
Thank
Richard had me laugh out loud of just thinking about having an award that is called Super Duper Overachiever Neighborhood Association. We'll have
Yes.
to take it under advisement.
I'm not sure if that's a okay. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thanks for joining us online. I'm SD one more alphabetically and then you. So
Oh, Madam Mayor, I had a question.
Richard.
Still there? If not, I can contact him later.
Yeah, I think
It was about identifying the name of the irrigation lateral that goes from north to south, but I can do some research and figure that out.
okay, great. And I bet somebody in his neighborhood association or neighborhood hears this and we'll be able to get that from him. Southeast Neighborhood Association, Eric. I don't know if it's Eric Berg. I just know that somebody from oh, hello, Eric. Here you are. Welcome.
Thank you. Eric Berg, 1301 South Grant Ave, Boise, Idaho. Cities have the capability of providing something for everyone, only because and only when they're created by everyone. Jane Jacobs. Zoning codes are meant to be living things that respond to the needs of the city they're built for. They are best built when everyone has a seat at the table and at the most granular level where specifics can be hammered out and responded to. In March, CENA sent a letter to you asking for the final vote of the zoning code rewrite be delayed until after the fully districted council is seated in 2024 in January. While our position remains the same, if you are to vote on it now and adopt the zoning code rewrite, the board of CENA voted unanimously to bring 3 overall concerns to your attention. There are many instances in the code that line by line we could go through with our suggestions, but these were the most important issues that both our neighbors and CENA felt that the council could address in adoption of this code. First, agreements between stakeholders independent of the code need to be honored. These are all over the city, which neighborhood associations have worked incredibly hard to build. For example, going all the way back to zoning code issues in the 90s, CENA worked with Boise State University to build agreements reflected in both the 97, 2005 to 2008, and 2015 Boise State master plans. These master plans allowed for Boise State's growth while protecting the neighborhood south of Beacon Street. These were recently expanded upon to address concerns in the collegiate subdivision area between the neighbors and Boise State, and have been really effective in building trust between the neighborhood and the university. The council should make clear that nothing in the rewrite would undermine these community agreements to build trust in the code. Proposed changes to heights at the campus boundaries from 45 to 70 feet in the zoning code rewrite seem to conflict with these past understandings, for example. Second, any code will require adjustments. We all know this, but especially in a complete rewrite. The council, planning and zoning, and staff will need to be as proactive as possible to respond to and fix issues as they become apparent. The best government improvement to the code will build trust and prevent the need for future wholesale rewrites. We ask that a semi-annual or annual outreach and review of the code be instituted to find out what is working and what is not. For example, if the density target is being accomplished in an already dense R2 zone with the current 35-foot heights, a tightening of the code back from 45 to 35 might be warranted. If loopholes pop up, they may necessitate emergency ordinances and immediate action from the council before bad development cascades throughout town. In addition, by laying out the reasoning behind these fixes and what issues they are responding to, we'll build a lot of faith that concerns are being addressed. Third, the council must make sure that notification requirements are not relaxed as proposed in the code. This is an issue of transparency and accountability for neighbors, developers, and the cities. If notifications are required, it prevents the surprise of a project that can be the most jarring part of development. The new online development tracker is fantastic, but it is no replacement for the traditional tool of a postcard in a mailbox, letting them know about a project. Whether they are commission or administrative level approvals, this transparency and openness in the process streamlines it and helps diffuse issues with development before they start. We understand the development community's request to streamline the process. However, relaxing the notification requirements would actually do the opposite. Countless times we've seen issues get resolved before anything needed to go before a commission, just because neighbors were made aware of a project and had their concerns addressed by the developer. Neighborhood notifications are vital to a code that works for everyone because it involves everyone. It's a commitment from the city code itself to inform the public at every step. It's not only good practice, but vital if we want to have the trust and support of residents for this code. Regardless of your decision tonight, or preferably after a districted council is seated, the most important action you can take are the ones moving forward. In amending the code to respect everybody's agreements, respond to everybody's issues, and inform everyone, you can fulfill the promise that Jane Jacobs laid out of building a city forever. I want to just quickly go to the time. I don't see an issue with a 5-minute time for neighborhood associations, as long as if, let's say, a developer goes over 15 minutes, then a neighborhood association can get greater time. I just think of some of the massive projects that ENA has dealt with St. Luke's, or some of the big ones we deal with Boise State, where 5 minutes wouldn't be adequate. I'm open myself to questions.
Thank you, Eric. Questions for Eric?
Madam Mayor.
Yep.
Eric, you mentioned a board vote. How large is your SENA board at this point?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Woodings, our board is, I believe, 14 or 15 at this point. We're a unique neighborhood association in that we have districted our board. So only so many people can be on the board from each of the parts of the neighborhood association in an attempt to get representation from the variety of neighborhoods that SENA spans, all the way from Boise State out to Columbia Village and everywhere else.
Great. And was there any other additional outreach other than to your board around the position you were taking on the zoning code?
So our process was we utilized, and thanks to the city for this, the yearly mailer to drive people to our annual meetings and tried to get some feedback that way. We also understand that it's sometimes hard to get feedback unless you're very proactive. So we sent myself and other members of our board to as many of the community meetings. And I thank the mayor for coming to the one at Timberline for the zoning code rewrite. We tried to really participate in those to reach people that maybe the city reached that we were unable to. We've emailed out to our list, and I think maybe a thing that we could look at in the future for Energize grants is give multiple mailers to neighborhood associations when there are big issues like the zoning code rewrite going through, which might help gain more input. But we tried to synthesize the things that the concerns that people gave to us and synthesize it into what I'm presenting tonight.
Great, thank you.
Madam Mayor.
We've got another one, Eric.
Eric, thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for all the work that you do. And thanks for the specificity in the time kind of management that you talked about as well. I did have one question just in regards to notifications for neighbors. if there's a specific type of development that you're concerned about happening, or is it just sort of in general, you want the same notifications across the board? Or is there something specific that you see not requiring notification that you have particular concerns about?
In Cena's opinion, when we talked about this and when we've talked to neighbors, they always feel that more communication is best. So there's nothing specifically in terms of type of project, whether it's, commercial, residential, multifamily, that isn't really as much of a concern as giving people a heads up before they see dirt turned, because that is often the point where people go, wait a minute, the trees are getting cut down, the dirt's getting turned, and the house is getting torn. What's going on here? So I think it's more of just an accountability and transparency, which also protects the city and developers in that someone can say, well, I never knew. And that's, well, you're on the list of people we mailed. So it protects everybody involved to have that notification.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. That's helpful.
All right. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Good night. Next up, Esty with South Cole.
Hi, my name is Esty LaFrenz, and I am the president of South Cole Neighborhood Association. I've lived in my home at 7604 West Thunder Mountain Drive in Boise, Idaho for 22 years. I am a professional engineer, and I work with communities all over the Western United States to ensure environmentally friendly and sustainable growth practices are implemented. I and the South Cole neighborhood have concerns about Boise's zoning code rewrite. Upzoning alone is not the answer to affordable housing. Upzoning is not sufficient to address affordability challenges without complementary measures, such as the provision of mandatory affordable housing programs or incentives. The city has already stated that the ZCR can only suggest the incentives, but not require them. When the zoning regulations allow for more intensive development, the land becomes more valuable and property values rise. Developers are in business to make money. The ZCR de-incentivizes home ownership by making it easier to build multifamily units on previous single-family home lots. Our established, modest, single-family home lots in R1C neighborhoods will be forever altered by prospectors looking to buy up cheap property to place multi-story and multi-unit developments. Single-family home ownership will be pushed into the surrounding region, adding to urban sprawl, the only place where single-family homes might remain more affordable. We are asking for requirements in the ZCR to protect Boise's existing, already established single-family home residential lots to ensure stability in our communities and a city for everyone. The one P&Z commissioner indicated that we should just pass the ZCR and see what happens. That comment was appallingly irresponsible. Why don't we look at other cities that tried to densify their zoning codes? San Francisco implemented various upzoning policies in an effort to address its housing affordability crisis. But despite the intention to increase housing supply, the city experienced a surge in demand, leading to rising property prices and rents. Seattle implemented the mandatory housing affordability program, and Portland implemented a plan called Residential Infill Project, both of which increased housing density in established neighborhoods, which increased land values and property prices, making housing less affordable for existing residents. Learn from these cities. Consider including neighborhood leaders in adjusting the code to protect existing residents while adding density to places that make sense to do so. Thousands of people rely on groundwater wells as their source of clean water. Dry wells and dwindling groundwater supplies happened last summer to many hundreds of people in my community of Southwest Boise and also Northwest Boise. When wells go dry, it can cost $30,000 to $50,000 to drill a new, deeper well. And hooking up to Veolia water may not be an option because proper water infrastructure and pipelines were never installed in those areas. Last week, the city of Phoenix announced a limit on construction and a pause on approvals for new development as their groundwater disappears. If we keep building without adequate infrastructure and resources, it's only a matter of time, Boise. It's time to slow down and plan carefully, not speed up. The ZCR should not be rushed, and SCNA feels that the vote by City Council should be postponed until we have a duly elected City Council, based on the 2021 requirements to elect City Council representatives by districts within the city, and not by a council with 1/3 of the people appointed by the mayor. A decision of this magnitude that will affect every single resident in the city should require representation of the voters within all of Boise's geographic districts. It stands to reason that approval of the city's zoning codes and building laws should be postponed until after the November 2023 election. And I'd like to take the opportunity to answer the questions that were asked of the neighborhood associations.
Are there questions for Esty?
Madam Mayor.
Good.
I guess I've heard that that we should wait until a new council is elected feedback before, and I guess you just help me understand it. I mean, hundreds of people worked on this for 5 years before even any of these people went through an election. We've got over 1,000 public comments that were reviewed and incorporated in the code. This is a body of work that has been in progress and has been, drafted and created for longer than half this council has been here. And it just seems odd to me that changing a few individuals on the council, it's the suggestion that they would then change the code dramatically would be representative. They'd be giving 3 people or 4 people or whatever it is. The idea is that they would then have authority to go undo all that work that all the people in the community have done. So I fundamentally don't understand it. Can you help me understand that argument?
I think that there are a lot of people in our communities that are not aware of this zoning code rewrite in itself. And I think by having a representative in each of the districts of the city could help further the understanding and the education of our communities to be better informed. I think there's going to be a lot of people that are blindsided to what is happening.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Mayor, thank you so much, SD, for coming out tonight. I want to add to what Councilmember Bajan just said. I attended one of the meetings in Southwest Boise out at the Victory branch of the Ada County Library, and it was very well attended. There were a lot of folks who came out, and it was interesting to kind of move throughout the city and see what everyone, what everyone's opinions were in different areas. And I thought that was really enlightening. And it strikes me that I did all of that work to go to all of these neighborhoods in Boise and then to say, no, you probably shouldn't vote on this. You should let the next person vote on that. It's a little bit, I don't know, a little bit insulting. So I just want to put that out there. And then as to my real question, how does South Cole engage your residents in your position on the zoning code?
Yeah, let me talk about the public outreach that we did. So we feel that neighborhood associations are the leaders in our communities, and we take the time to understand and learn the issues on developments and on major projects like the zoning code rewrite. So SCNA held a pie social in April, right before the planning and zoning meetings. We had about 65 people in attendance. We also talked to our annual meeting in December, and we did as much educational information during that meeting as we could on the zoning code rewrite. We had about 75 people at that meeting. I was also in attendance at the Victory Library and at West Junior High when the city came in and gave that information. I talked to a lot of residents in my community. We received comments by email, we received comments by Facebook, and I tried to incorporate as much as I could. We did as much effort as we could to educate and engage our community. But to remove neighborhood associations from that process, I think is going to limit the understanding and the education of getting this information to our communities. And so I think it's really vital that neighborhood associations are engaged with their communities. It is very difficult. I agree with that. And I think the city should help us and not try to put something in between us so that we are no longer able to speak for them. There are a lot of people in my community that feel marginalized and that the city doesn't listen to us. So they don't come out to these things and they don't put their information out, but they rely on the neighborhood association to speak for them.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Madam Mayor, thank you for the outreach, especially the pie social. I love pie. If you'd ever like to invite me, I'd be happy to come and sample. You have 7 minutes or 7 seconds left on the clock if there's anything else that you might want to say.
I do. I think big projects like the Mergurdio Park project, like the Boise Open Space Alliance project, and for other neighborhood associations that spoke about Blue Valley and Interfaith Sanctuary, I think they need up to 20 minutes for those types of projects for the neighborhood association to speak.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Yep, we've got one more question.
I heard a lot of your testimony talking about the preservation of single-family homes for homeowners. And I would ask the other neighborhood associations to talk about this as well in their presentations. But what percentage of your board are renters?
We only have 8 people on our board currently, and I believe everyone is a homeowner.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, one more question. Because you brought it up specifically about neighborhood associations' time on a big application. How do you think it should work when when a project or development isn't going on in a particular neighborhood association? Should they also get time to testify, or is it only the neighborhood association within that development? Because the problem would be if there's 20 minutes per neighborhood association and we allow as many neighborhoods maybe who want to do it on, let's say, an interfaith application, potentially that ends up being a really, really long meeting in addition to all the people from those neighborhoods who are testifying. So that's kind of like a little nuanced thing that I'm trying to figure out is if there's additional time, is the additional time given to everybody who wants? Is it only if it's within their area? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the neighborhood association knows most about what is happening in their own communities and hears from the residents in the surrounding area. So I do understand there are some projects that are like on borderlines of different neighborhood associations. And I think that giving a total amount of time, like a total amount of 20 minutes where they figure out how to best split it up is appropriate. Thank you.
All right, next we're gonna, well, I should ask, any more S's? Oh, you're here. I didn't have you on my list, but I knew you were here. Yes, Marissa, come on up. Southwest Ada County Alliance. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Marissa Keith. I'm at 3279 South Cloverdale in Boise, and I'm the president of the Southwest Ada County Alliance Neighborhood Association. So the topics that I'm going to discuss, our position was voted on 4/20 and discussed again on 5/8 by the SWACA board. We had 10 members at the time of the vote, but now we're down to 7 members. We had some resignations. So we would prefer at least 10 minutes as well. One of the most imminent issues affecting the residents of Southwest Boise, as SD talked about, is the level of groundwater out there. So there was some confusion at P&Z about well water, like who has it, what is it used for? It is used by many people for drinking, laundry, showering, as well as irrigation. And so according to info that we received from Veolia, there are actually 5,709 residential properties in Boise, within the Boise city limits, that don't have Veolia services. And so we're assuming that those people, unless they have a cistern or are using bottled water, are on a well. So the assured water supply for 50 years, it sounds good in theory, though 50 years does seem fairly short. But the assured water supply for one development does not guarantee that the water supply will remain for their neighbors. The amount of water being taken out and consumed is important, but just as important is the amount of water being put back into the aquifer. And so as land use changes, particularly in Southwest Boise, from ag and semi-rural to urban, the flood irrigation that goes back down into the aquifer is reduced, and this will continue to have an adverse effect on residents in Southwest Boise who rely on a well. So whether the code addresses it or not, we would encourage the city to continue to explore and address this issue and the effects on residents. And if there are any other ways to incorporate water seepage into the aquifer through additional features such as unlined ponds and waterways, I hope that that is also considered. But either way, in the future, I think that is something that the city is going to have to address.
So could you say that last, you said either way, but then I didn't.
I think that the water shortage in Southwest is something that the city will need to address.
Sorry.
The other issue that has been discussed in depth by SWACA board and members in reading the code is it seems also to be heavy on creating more rental units as opposed to home ownership. And so we've seen this trend of entire single family home subdivisions being held by corporations and rented out to residents, or multi-building complexes that are held by corporations. And this not only takes local money out of state, but makes our community more vulnerable to the unpredictability of rent increases. We have a unique subdivision in SWACA that is maybe like 15 duplexes, and many of these have the owner living on one side and their tenant is on the other. And so the board would like to see, excuse me, the city encourage and support ownership of these small mom and pop landlords and discourage the corporate landlords as much as you're able to. Our board also believes that neighborhood notification and awareness is important. As part of that, we would like to see the development tracker be placed on the homepage of the website, the city website, so it's much easier to find. Other things that we would like to see addressed are maintaining the buffer between drive-throughs and residential lots. We wrote comments in about this, and perhaps include daycares, parks, and schools in that protection. SWACA is not known for our.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you again. Are you suggesting, so I heard buffer between drive-through and residential, and you're saying we should also consider buffer between drive-through and childcare, school, et cetera?
Yes.
Was that, okay,
correct.
I just want to
Yes.
make sure I understood.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Madam Mayor, can I ask a clarification while you're there? Marissa, you had talked about adding something to the tracker and I didn't get the whole thing.
I'm just adding it to the homepage.
Oh, to
So
the homepage.
of the city website. Right now, you have to, I believe you have to
Find it.
go to development services and it's on a list on the side. So making it easier to find would be helpful.
Thank you.
So SWACA is not yet known for our cellular bike ped infrastructure on our arterials, though hopefully the new code will, with the requirement of a 10-foot pathway and street trees on arterials and collectors will change that. But the majority of our neighborhoods within their mile block sections are very low stress roads. And so our residents tend to have more than the average number of children, and those kids ride within their mile block sections a lot. So we are seeing more and more multifamily dwellings. And one of the things that we kind of picked up and the board would like to see changed is to tie the number of long-term bike parking to the number of bedrooms in a multifamily unit. Right now, it's just tied to the number of units. So if you have 10 units, you have 10 long-term spots. If you have 10 3-bedroom units, you have 10 long-term spots. And that needs to be looked at in our opinion. So Councilmember Woodings, just for your information, we have discussed the zoning code at nearly every NA meeting for the last 3 years. I was on the rewrite committee, so whether my board wanted to or not, they got to hear about it. We had over 50 people at our annual meeting and we discussed both sides of the rewrite there. We have posted to Facebook both the city's community outreach events, the timelines for the code, deadlines for comments, link to city websites for both the draft and the final versions. We've brought this up at many developer held neighborhood meetings, which is always popular, as well as the dry well meetings that were held by a resident of Swaka. There were 3 which I attended, and those had over 70 people at each one. I also hosted the zoning code book club once a week for 6 weeks, which is open to all NAs and any others who asked to attend. And it was also attended by city staff so that questions could be answered in depth.
Madam Mayor, just to be clear, when you say long-term bike parking, you're kind of referring to the definitions like covered, secure, lit, those types of things.
Yeah, the long term is covered, secured, typically in a room, protected, and then the short term is, on the street, on a bike rack, on the street.
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I know you repeated yourself again, but I still feel like I missed it. We talked about the buffer. You said between residential and childcare, and there was another.
Parks or schools.
Okay.
So we had, this came up last year, I think. We had a potential drive-through going in next to some residential that had been approved but not yet built, and the drive-through would have fallen within that 200-foot buffer. And so because of that buffer, it was denied. But if that buffer had not been there, then the drive-through would have also gone next to this developer's tot lot. So I think one of my writings in, I think I've written 2 or 3 things, I'm sorry. One of the things was when I was at the Molinar Park splash pad opening, there was a big sign that says this is an idle free zone next to the playground. And there's a reason why we have those, and I just feel that should be expanded to other parts of the city.
Thank you.
I had one other question. You referenced mom and pop landlords versus corporate landlords, and we hear this and know that there's concern about this. I'm not sure that we have the tools we all wish we had, but I'm curious about that neighborhood that you talked about, where you said there were duplexes, I think, and somebody lived in one, and on the other side they rented. Was that required in the CCNR's HOA, or it's just happened organically, or how'd that happen?
It's just happened. And it's actually a neighborhood that's unfinished from the 1970s. There's still a lot of empty lots there. So maybe it hasn't, I don't know why it happened. There was just a neighborhood meeting there at one point, and everybody there seemed to be a landlord who also lived there,
Okay.
and their tenant next to them. And it was very interesting just to see this community.
Yeah, great, thanks. All right, thank you, Marissa. And thanks also for serving on the committee. Appreciate it. And to whoever it was that said that people aren't excited about planning and zoning discussions, I guess they should get to know your book club. Now we're moving on to V's. So Katie Decker or Matt Serrani, are you online for Veterans Park?
Katie is.
Hi, Katie, welcome.
Hi. For the record, my name is Katie Decker. My address is 5001 West Mimosa Street, and I'm presenting on behalf of Veterans Park Neighborhood Association. I'd just like to open by saying that our neighborhood association does support the bulk of the core goals that we're talking about with the zoning code rewrite that it's aiming to address. But we're concerned that the adoption draft as written may not fulfill the goals, and in some cases may counter them. So Veterans Park is a collection of narrow neighborhoods that is then bisected by State Street. And as you know, we have a large portion of low-income residents, and we have approximately 50% renters in our neighborhood. Under the proposed zoning code, we would expect to see redevelopment of the entire State Street corridor, which is something that the city's been working towards for a long time. But we'd also expect that approximately 40% of the residential lots in our neighborhood would be strongly incentivized to be redeveloped, because they are those R2 lots that by code, they will be the new minimum lot size will be half of the current minimum lot size. So there's a strong incentive to split those into 2 lots. In our case, since a large number of them would be rezoned from what are currently R1 lots, they may be even able to be split farther than 2 lots. So looking at the affordability incentives in this code, I just don't see any likelihood that the new development that's coming would provide enough affordable units even to rehouse our existing low income residents living in those 40% of our R2 will be R2 lots who will be likely to be displaced by this impending redevelopment, much less of the 50% of low income units that a socioeconomically well stratified, well integrated neighborhood would need to house all of those that are making at or below the median income. So for us, our neighborhood identity is very much a mixed income, working class area. And I think that we're looking at losing that identity under the new code with the lack of affordability benefits. So I'd say that the biggest issues I hear from our neighborhood residents, in addition to the frustration with the reduction of the neighborhood association time, are the insufficient affordability of incentives as they apply to our zone, coupled with the lack of any affordability incentives in the MX5 zone. And also, since MX4 is eligible to basically upzone into unlimited height with MX5, that's been a concern. There's a 55% increase in the entitled height along State Street, going from 45 feet to 70 feet. And as other neighborhoods have mentioned, there's a lack of any step down requirements between MX3 and the rezoned R2 neighborhood. So it's still a drastic height difference that is making people uncomfortable. The expansion of commercial uses in the new R2 zones that people are currently in R1C and looking at these new commercial areas coming in, the allowance of 12 unit multifamily developments in R1 areas with incentives. And then by far the most I hear about is the weakening of the CUP impact criteria language, which can be used to locate high impact public benefit uses without mitigating the impacts. So in general, there's been a lot of frustration that although the city's public position is that no changes to shelter at code are being made here, there are several changes that make it easier to site shelters and other services for the unhoused populations in a broader array of zones than what the code currently allows, or with weaker CUP conditions, despite this council speaking at length about the importance of being able to apply conditions specific to the shelter proposal that was before you last year. I also want to note that there's the inherent problem with relaxing standards with the intent of tightening them later if future government recognizes any problems. That's both applicable to the new height entitlements and new allowed use zones, but it becomes an entitlement associated with the property. So any attempt to pull it back later would be considered a takings affecting the real value of the property. To this end, I would like to see all of the MX height increases under this code to be allowed only when affordability and sustainability incentives are met, instead of a broad new entitlement. I would hope that this would allow the land market to adjust to prices based on supply of affordable units rather than market rate units. With regard to the neighborhood association presentation time, I think that reduction of the scope of the neighborhood association is concerning, and some of the questions tonight are failing to acknowledge the level of privilege that's required to be able to present as a member of the public. Privileges such as evening time available, paying for parking downtown, navigating reduced evening transit schedules, experience with public speaking, or even having internet access, which is something we've run into in our neighborhood. So having a collective voice for more in-depth commentary on high-profile projects is an important function of the neighborhood association.
Time.
Sorry,
Katie,
I had more to say on that. Yes.
Yeah, Katie, you're at time, but you were answering a question that we've asked others. So if you have more on the specific timing for neighborhood associations.
Yeah, so
and
our
then
association, oh, you said and then.
there's a delay, and then on the process that you went through to solicit input.
Okay. So our neighborhood association has presented on some projects where 5 minutes would be totally fine and was totally fine. And we've also presented on projects where 30 minutes would still be insufficient. So in my opinion, code could provide a minimum of 5 minutes, but should also still guarantee matching the applicant presentation. And I think addressing the comment about kind of the inherent uncertainty of knowing how much time you'll have to present until the night of, I think you could just say at code that the presentation time will be distributed a minimum of 1 week before the hearing and that it would be equal. In our experience, distributing meaningful comments over a broader presenter pool was logistically very complicated. And we did see the city council discouraging that type of presentation by people who had not been directly involved in the research last year. I think that one potential solution, talking about the time issue, could be engineering a system where you can have members of the public sign up to testify, but like click a box that allows them to cede their time to their neighborhood association to allow a more centralized presentation of argument. That could potentially reduce the overall time that you spend listening, but still allow for the more in-depth arguments presented in a cohesive manner. With regard to outreach, I'd say that for at least a year, maybe a year and a half, we've been including sort of a change summary document at our neighborhood gatherings. So a table set up with a neighborhood association member present and able to talk to people and ask them if they've heard about the zoning code and what they see as good and bad and different. We haven't really had people sign a sheet and check a box about what they do and don't support, but through that process, I'd say I've probably spoken with between 100 and 150 people over the last year and a half. And then our board, so our most recent board meetings, I think had 20 or 30 people. When we said, look, the zoning code is coming up, we've submitted our comments, this is what they said. But that was informed by the broader testimony. I would say that our largest, our most well-attended events are the social gatherings, and the $50 food limit that the city has applied to grant funding does make it challenging to host those. And that's where we see a lot of renter participation based on some of the privileges that we talked about before. We've had trouble getting renters who have the time for an evening meeting once a month to commit to actually being on the board, but we are hearing more from renters at our social gatherings, but are having trouble figuring out how to host those with the limited food funding.
Madam Mayor, Katie, that grant funding comment was really helpful feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions for Katie? Katie, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Have a good night.
Thanks, you too.
And now we've got Vista Neighborhood Association, Mark Phillips. And Mark, I saw on here that you had crossed off Kim Bentley. Are you the new contact person?
Vice President. She was the former president.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that must have been an old form. Madam Mayor and City Council, my name is Mark Phillips. I live at 2815 West Limhi Street, and I'm the Vice President of Vista Neighborhood Association. I've lived in that neighborhood for 25 years, recently Vice President and involved in the Neighborhood Association for about a year, so I'll do my best to answer some of your process questions. We've compiled a letter that I've been tasked to read here, and I will commence with that. The Vista Neighborhood Association would like to request that the City Council defer voting on the proposed zoning code rewrite until after the 2023 elections in November for the following reasons. Point number one, the Vista neighborhood does not currently have representative on the City Council. Our association is particularly concerned about this situation because our neighborhood will be greatly impacted by the zoning rewrite. We would like to ensure we have a method to share our thoughts and concerns with the City Council. Point number two is we would prefer there be more time allotted for Boise residents to read, analyze, and understand how these potential changes would impact our neighborhood's way of life. Thank you for hearing our concerns. If you have questions, please let us know. And I, of course, will stand for questions.
Thank you. That was very brief.
We are a somewhat anemic neighborhood association. And to answer your question, we have approximately 8 to 10 people.
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
Sir, can you just elaborate on your second point? You wanted more time to consider. I just didn't totally
Yeah,
understand.
I certainly can. Our neighborhood association wasn't really aware of all the aspects of the zoning code rewrite. We just barely getting up to speed in the last couple of months. So that's kind of where that point came from.
So you want more time to consider this code, not you want
Yes.
more time in the code to consider future things.
No, correct. Just more time to dive in and understand it. There seemed to be a general consensus of not really knowing how it will impact us, what will happen. That's where that point came from.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah.
You've got 3 minutes and 48 seconds if you want to answer any of the questions that have become standard.
So I think I covered we had 8 to 10 people vote on this. And as far as, will you state the second point? What I wrote down here was something about notifying residents. I'll do my best to answer that.
The other question we've been asking a lot of folks is how much time do you think the neighborhood association should be guaranteed, or should we keep things the same as far as it being a little more ambiguous, but closer to meeting the same time as the applicant?
Well, again, being somewhat new to the process, I guess I would say, similar time to the applicant and or what it used to be. You never want to lose the opportunity to engage and give feedback. So I guess that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a good night. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
All right. We've got West Downtown next. Kelly Tagg, welcome. And then I've got West End. Chris. And then are there others here for neighborhood associations that haven't spoken? How about online?
Madam Mayor, I do have one more neighborhood association online for later.
Okay, great. So we've got 3 neighborhood associations. If there are a couple members of the public here that end up wanting to testify, we might be able to do that too. Welcome.
You ready? Okay, so Kelly Tagg, 1820 West Jefferson Street, Boise, Idaho. So good evening. I am the president of the West Downtown Neighborhood Association and Mayor McLean and City Council. I appreciate you allowing time for the neighborhood associations to provide our feedback and being involved in this decision-making process. And so I apologize. My speech is going to seem a little disjointed because I was rewriting it as you're asking questions. So I want to make sure I cover the important points. So as far as neighborhood engagement, so full disclosure, I was on the Citizens Advisory Committee. So this is something that I enthusiastically talked at length anytime I had an opportunity in the neighborhood. Also, several of our board members and other residents attended some of the citizen outreach meetings that took place at schools and libraries over the past couple of years. And as far as when there was opportunity to provide feedback on surveys and so forth, I certainly encouraged our neighbors to do that by advertising on our Facebook page and as well as our website. And also prior to meetings, especially when I knew it was something that was going to be a hot topic that was going to be specific to our neighborhood and the Citizens Advisory Committee, I would speak with the other board members and neighbors to get their feedback, so that as part of my preparation for those meetings. We currently have 9 board members. We had 10 at the time that we met and discussed and took a vote specifically related to this. And I'm also very proud to say we have 3 renters on our board. We've worked really hard to increase our outreach to the renters in our neighborhood, and they're fantastic. So we're so happy that they are part of the board. So we did have a formal board meeting on April 12th. That was our regular spring meeting. And this was the main topic that we discussed. And in general, the board supports the zoning rewrite, but we did have a few concerns, and I wanted to make sure that I covered those before I answer any of the other questions. Our number one concern is that in the R3 zone, or we would like to have the R3 zone added to the neighborhood transition standards in sections 11.04.03.5 to address the transition of MX zones to the R3 zone. So it's been a while since our associations had business in front of this board. or in front of this council. So I just wanted to kind of tell you a little bit about us. We are a transitional neighborhood between the very dense urban downtown area to the more residential west end. And we have, once this zoning goes through, we will have a combination of MX5, MX3, MX1 and R3. So we have, which is the R3 area of our neighborhood is not going to change, but we do have like this little small pocket of our neighborhood that is, you know, in that R3 zoning, in that R3 area, we currently have small apartments, fourplexes, triplexes, duplexes, single family homes. Some of them have been converted into multi-units. Some of them have added ADUs. So we have just about every type of housing in our neighborhood. And so that, but most of those properties, they are 2 stories tall max. So along Fairview and State, we have the MX3 and MX1 zone. And so we would like to see a transition add in there. That would include, so in that section A, the applicability to the R3 zone for that's abutting the MX zones, building and parking setbacks, as well as the building height step downs. The second concern of the neighborhood was drive-through facilities. The board applauds all of the standards that were included in drive-throughs, but we're a little disappointed to see they were added to, I think it's all MX zones now. So it was restricted, fairly restricted. Now it's all MX zones. And so the main concern is the new code requires drive-throughs be in the back of the buildings. Well, that would be part of the buildings that abut the residential part of our neighborhoods. And the measures, it mentions measures in place to determine the possible adverse effects, but it doesn't say what those measures are. It's not defined. So we'd like to see that a little more clearly defined. And then third, and you've heard a lot of talk about this tonight, is the notifications of neighbors that are impacted by projects, especially in type 1 and type 2 projects. At the very least, a mailer to them just to let the neighbors know, you know, information about the project, the timeline, and most importantly, who to contact if there's some issues to discuss during the construction project. We've had 2 new projects in our neighborhood, and you know, some of the workers were parking illegally, and there were some other things that went on. They stacked things in an alley that made it difficult for residents to access their garages. So it's nice to know who to call if we have a problem. So that's why we think the neighborhood notification process is very important.
Time.
Wow, that went fast.
It did, but you answered 2 of the bonus questions in your testimony, so you can keep going.
Oh, okay, good. All right. So
like 45 seconds.
Okay, good. So yeah, so the main thing you asked about time for neighborhood associations, I say at the very minimum 10 minutes. There are more complex issues like the interfaith sanctuary, and in our neighborhood a few years ago, it was a CVS pharmacy. Those, I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about that CVS pharmacy. So maybe, you know, have an ability to provide feedback and say, you know, maybe, you know, negotiate time for the neighborhoods. I also love following Katie. She's always great. She always has the best ideas. Another thing is prioritizing when there's an issue in our neighborhood that might be controversial and people from other parts of the city want to participate in the conversation, to prioritize those people from the neighborhood so we can kind of get in up front. And what we did with CVS Pharmacy is we picked topics, assigned them to neighbors. And so we were able to organize a presentation. And that was really helpful in being able to get that done. And I think I answered all the questions. Did I? Okay. Anything else?
Thank you.
Great,
Madam Mayor.
thanks.
Oh, wait, I don't know why I did that. Of course, people keep having questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
More of a request. You gave us some really specific suggestions. Can we get a copy of your testimony? Because I was trying to follow right along and would like to see it written down.
Oh, sure. You're talking about the points as far as the
All of it.
rezone, the mix. Okay.
All of it.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That it? Alrighty. Okay. Chris Testa, come on up. And then what neighborhood association is online?
Centennial Neighborhood Association.
Great. Okay. Welcome, Chris.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, council members. My name is Chris Testa. I am I'm at 900 North 28th Street in Boise. I'm the president of the West End Neighborhood Association, and I'll be speaking on behalf of WINA today. Thank you so much for the time to represent the views of my neighbors. I want to start by acknowledging the fact that the city has gone through a lengthy due diligence process that has focused on education and outreach to our community. I want to commend the city staff for their assimilation of a tremendous amount of feedback that has been incorporated into this modern zoning code. We felt that there were many opportunities for input throughout the process, and we're grateful for the ongoing partnership that we have with the city of Boise. Within the boundary of the West End neighborhood, we have approximately 2,700 households today. There's an estimated 2,000 more housing units expected in currently approved plans, as well as a 10-acre plot that CWI plans to develop into a campus, and another 44 acres for sale right now at the Idaho Transportation Department facility. To say the West End neighborhood is going through rapid growth and change would be an understatement. To keep our community informed and represented, we formed a housing and development committee as part of our board, and they've taken a proactive approach to working with the city and other stakeholders who may have an impact on the fabric of the West End. I want to take a moment and read the vision of our housing and development committee for you. The vision statement of that committee is to maintain and enhance our historic character and urban forest, the diversity of housing types and styles, and connectivity to outdoor recreation that makes the West End neighborhood unique. The modern zoning code as proposed seems to embody that vision. With so many new developments planned in the West End, we're hopeful that the modern zoning code will enhance our neighborhood with new and infill developments that are thoughtful and aligned with that continued effort to support the needs of our community. Specific points of emphasis outlined in the modern zoning code that we support are housing for all income levels, a safe and comfortable environment for walking and biking, expanding access to open space and integrating nature into the urban environment, and supporting the resilient tree canopy. With that said, we do have one request of the council regarding the zoning code adoption draft. One of the pillars in the modern zoning code is housing options that suit the character of the neighborhood. In the West End, we somewhat have a uniquely large number of early 20th century single-story homes on standard lots that are currently zoned R2 and R3. It's our understanding that the height limits afforded in R2 and R3 in the modern zoning code could impact those homes. I want you to imagine for a second that you're living in the craftsman home that you grew up in and inherited from your parents. You enjoy the 100-year-old canopy that covers your backyard and that you share with your neighbors. Now let's say the house next door ages out and is replaced by a 45-foot tall multifamily unit. Irrespective of setbacks, losing that expansive tree canopy and facing a 4-story wall is going to feel intrusive. We'd like to see the neighborhood transition standards for building height step downs that are afforded in R1 zones also apply in R2 and R3, specifically when there's a single family or single story home next door. In conclusion, we really appreciate the opportunity to partner with the city. We feel that this is an important project and look forward to contributing to a community for all. Before I close, I did want to comment and answer the question that Councilmember Halliburton has been asking. And in the back, we've been talking about it, and I think an idea that could be beneficial is, as opposed to changing the allotted time allowed, providing and echoing what Kelly Tagg had just mentioned, providing an opportunity to organize your neighborhood members and stack those testimonies so that you can provide a coordinated approach. What that does is it, instead of giving a select few of neighborhood association representatives and a forwarded amount of time, it requires that those members come together and all testify in sequence to provide their well thought out deliberations and testimony. With that, I'll close. Thank you so much for your time.
I think you've got one.
Madam Mayor, yeah. Chris, I'm going to ask you my standard question too. How many folks were involved in creating your testimony on behalf of your neighborhood association, and how did you do that?
Yeah, I've delegated a lot of the work related to the zoning code rewrite to my Housing and Development Committee, as I mentioned. They were very active in all steps of the process and appreciated that. The testimony today was a collaboration with a few of my board members, which currently sits at 7 and has been sitting at 11 for a majority of our time. This topic has been deliberated and discussed at most of our neighborhood association meetings, and we've had countless questions and comments from neighbors throughout the process. And I feel like my committee has taken a very proactive approach to getting the consensus opinion of our neighborhood.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
I just want to be clear that I understand what you're saying. I think that you might be saying, rather than giving the allotted amount of time, given the neighborhood association the opportunity to stack multiple people, not necessarily from the neighborhood association, but just people from the neighborhood in general, to sort of make a coordinated presentation.
Correct.
Yep.
So if you have individuals, so as opposed to getting just that allotted 5 minutes or allotted 10 minutes, if you have passionate individuals that would be testifying for their allotted 3 minutes anyway, allowing those individuals to come together and provide a coordinated presentation on behalf of the neighborhood and that collective.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Lindsay, your screen sharing. All right, we've got one online. Which neighborhood association again?
Madam Mayor, this is Centennial Neighborhood Association, and it's Joe Legou.
Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Madam Mayor, council members, thanks for the opportunity. I think we can be really brief for Centennial. We did not intend to actually present tonight. In your packet for the testimony, and I guess this was the portion of testimony from June 2nd through June 8th. We're page 236, only 2 pages. What I would like to add beyond that, rather than going over everything that we put in writing to you, is I'll simply let you know we're one of your youngest neighborhood associations. We were organized a few years back prior to the pandemic, but we've basically done everything we could to survive during the pandemic, which has been challenging, but we've done okay. We've managed to. We created and what evolved as a position statement. We submitted that on the ZCR, on the zoning code rewrite, to the Planning and Zoning Commission in writing, as well as we made a presentation of all of the points. And so it's part of the record, and you've likely read it. In addition,
And Joe, what page was that again?
Page 236 of the testimony packet, June 2nd through June 8th.
Thank you.
So that has basically our bullet points, and we tried to be brief. This was an evolved, prior to that was an evolved position statement, and we became pretty engaged in outreach for the Centennial Neighborhood Association, its members, about the time that the Boise Dev put together a survey, or they wanted to get input. And I think I'm sure that all the council members have read what was produced by Boise Dev and the input that they got. So ours was in there as well. And then from that, unfortunately, we were trying to react to get as much together as we possibly could as the Planning and Zoning Commission hearings were coming up, as well as yours. We did schedule, and we effectively held a meeting of our members on April 20th, whereas we presented the position statement, and we built consensus in there and finalized it. We even adopted a resolution. because we're a young neighborhood association, we've really tried to be by the book. And I think that I understand Councilmember Badgin's concern about, boy, does this just become a small group of people that are sort of running the whole show? We're trying to do the exact opposite of that, which is consistent with what you've asked us to do based on the bylaw structure that we have. And so getting our members to participate, very challenging, but we have a large mailing list, of what we believe is a large mailing list of about 70 people who actively receive our mass emails. We use social media, as well as if you look at our website at any time, centennialna.org, we have done an incredible job of trying to be extremely transparent, put a lot of information out there, and in fact, created a lot of links to city activities, particularly with regard to the zoning code rewrite. We have other initiatives beyond that, but what we've found is that the zoning code rewrite is a fairly complex piece of business, and it's not a magnet for getting people engaged and involved, partly because it's difficult to get your head around. And I think that we recognized that while we were building consensus. Nonetheless, we came up with our input for you. What we really believe, though, is that we are a voice that this voice, if we do our job properly, we should be effective, representative, and efficient for the city's purposes. So if we're doing that, it does beg the question, are the neighborhood associations truly being valued for the potential that they offer the city's leadership? If we can bring you synthesized, vetted, condensed input for these issues, we think we're doing a good job for you, and we can do it with time efficiency. So that takes us to the question of, well, what do we think we need in order to present for you, which is certainly the one that 10 minutes is an absolute minimum, we believe. And if it's a fairly quick thing for us to review, we'll use 3 and we'll step away from the podium. If it's a complex issue where we've got a developer that's in our backyard, wrong term to use, that's in our within our borders trying to build something and it's highly controversial, and yeah, we might need to put together quite the presentation. 20 minutes might be appropriate, but some flexibility. It would be nice, though, to just have a standard of knowing that we come in to 10 minutes as a minimum and we can do our presentation accordingly. With regard to our outreach, going back to Councilmember Wooding's question, boy, we try to get everything out that we possibly can via our website, emails. We've even done knocking on doors over some issues, and we're not doing a lot in terms of lit drops because we have funding concerns, but we would like to see, as was suggested by another NA, that if there's a possibility of actually doing more multiple postcard mailers during the course of the year, we might have better outreach that way as well. I'll keep, like I said, I was trying to keep this brief, but I think that pretty well encapsulates this. The question is going to be also, I'm anticipating Councilmember Wooding's question. Our board is currently 4. We held an open meeting to which we had 10 people participate on April 20th, where we really vetted final consensus on our position paper. I'll call that the end of my presentation to you, and stand for any questions here.
Madam Mayor, I don't have any questions, maybe just some recommendations for you. So I think you brought up a really good point, that if your neighborhood association is doing a really good job with engagement, then it should be a huge asset to the city. 100% agree. This probably isn't the appropriate time to do it, but if you have ideas, tools that you think would make it easier for your neighborhood association to engage with the rest of your neighbors, we have a new energized position at the city of Boise, and I'd be really interested in your feedback on tools that you think could help strengthen that outreach process. I just want to say thanks for testifying.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So that's everybody that I have on this list. Is anybody else here representing a neighborhood association? Are there folks who are here that were planning on testifying tomorrow, or the next day, that would like to testify now? You're gonna wait it out?
Maybe I have a
Well, I mean, since you testified as a neighborhood association person, I've got to just have you stick with that for now. All right. I think we should go ahead and see. I'm kind of making this up, staff. Sorry, but I wonder if there are questions for staff based on what we heard. If folks want to ask now while it's fresh, rather than trying to remember it all on Thursday. Go ahead, Patrick, go ahead. Councilmember Bajent, sorry.
Madam Mayor, a couple of questions, both from your initial presentation and from some of the comments from neighborhood associations. My first question pertains to the R2 conversion zone. And I guess it's a simple question. Is it too narrow? It's only 1/8 of a mile, which is 661 feet from the center line of a road. That's not much of a conversion zone. Is that the right number? And if it is, how do we arrive at it? And why is it the right number? Seems too narrow.
Mayor, Councilmember Bajent, good question. We discussed this a lot throughout the process and started actually at a 1/4 mile. 1/4 mile is often used in planning as it relates to especially accessibility to transit. And the reason 1/4 mile is important is because it's a 5-minute walk. And typically, if you look at the analysis around successful transit, it's within a 5-minute walk that you have your greatest concentration of people. So we started at the 1/4 mile. There was a lot of discussion and debate about it in the public process. And as a result, we reduced that to 1/8 of a mile from the center line. So I will tell you that a 1/4 mile is often used as the right distance. And the reason I say that is, remember with the R2 conversions, this is an intentional action related to this issue of you don't get these chances that often. Let's really organize this thing around the city that we want and the development pattern that is appropriate to this city. And that R2 conversion adjacent to those MX3s is an important one of many decisions we're making, but that's an important one. And so I think it's an important question. And so I'm giving you an answer that I hope is helpful, but usually that 1/4 mile is the threshold. We ended up as a result of this process that we went through backing off to the 1/8 of a mile.
Madam Mayor, I have 3. Can I just kind of tick through them or?
Good.
Okay, second, these aren't related to one another at all. So shifting gears, there was discussion about owner occupancy rules for ADUs and some other types of development. I'm allergic to those rules. I mean, obviously, this has come up on the council before, but I view them as a way of privileging and entrenching existing power and existing established economic interests to the detriment of people with less means. Giving a privilege to someone just because they happen to afford to be able to live in a nice neighborhood is the opposite of equity and justice in my mind. But what's the argument for owner occupancy rules on things like ADUs? Because right now, classifying somebody on the basis of their ability to purchase real estate or not, or whether they can live in real estate or not, seems arbitrary to me.
Well, I think the specifically Councilmember Bajent related to the accessory dwelling unit aspect of the ordinance, you got to remember that within those same districts that we're permitting an accessory dwelling unit, we're also permitting 2 units on a lot. So not an accessory unit, but 2 primary units on a lot. And we're actually in this proposal, including more than that, if they're affordable. So the thing that's unique to the accessory dwelling unit, part of this is that it's an accessory unit. So the idea with the accessory dwelling unit is you have the primary residence and then you have an accessory. So in those cases, you've got someone that owns the property that's living there and then has an accessory unit that they can rent out, they can have for a family member, they can rent out to someone else. But I think the accessory dwelling unit is a very specific thing, but that doesn't preclude other ways of approaching multiple units on a lot that makes the city more inclusive and available to people. There's many other options. It's just the accessory dwelling unit is a specific thing. Does that answer the question?
If that's the argument for it, yeah, that
I
answers
think
the
that's the
question.
argument for it.
Okay. Third unrelated thing, and this is a bigger topic I think we're going to discuss as the week goes on, but I'd like an introduction to a conversation about the third rail of local politics, which is parking. My recollection of this draft as it developed is that the parking minimums in different parts of the city have gone all over the place. We've landed where we landed by a process of consensus, I understand. Can you give us a brief overview of that generally, like where we started, what the current best practice in the country is, what the theories say, and where we landed and why? Sorry.
Briefly. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Councilmember, quickly, just the way you described our process is correct, where we started with more significant cuts in required off-street parking. And just so everybody's on the same page, what we're talking about is what the zoning ordinance, what the public through its zoning ordinance requires in terms of off-street parking. It doesn't mean how much parking we have, because in lots of cases, as you know, we get, number one, we get requests for more parking than we already require, or in some cases we get requests for less parking. The parking tends to be a product of where it is and what the approach to the development is. So what we're really talking about here is what does the public require of someone as it relates to parking? We started with more significant reductions in off-street parking requirements for the city related to all kinds of uses. And we ended up where we are as a result, as you said, council member, through a public process. There was a lot of debate. As you know, emotions run high in this particular topic, and those that feel there's not enough parking that exists, and then others that think we shouldn't be requiring any. I do think the direction is towards less, definitely, required parking in cities, because parking is devastating in many ways to the kind of, devastating to the life of the city, number one. And number two, it's incredibly expensive. We hear all the time, I'm sure you'll hear this week, how expensive a single parking space is, even a surface parking space. But my goodness, a deck parking space is tens of thousands of dollars. So the expense of it and how devastating it is to a city environment is why I think cities are really moving towards the elimination of those kinds of requirements. And when you think about it as a community, I think it makes sense. It's just really a reflection of what we value. We had a speaker tonight speaking about this very topic and talking about, hey, if the provision of parking and the public requiring it, because that's all we're talking about, not how much parking there is, but how much the public requires, if that's adding to the cost of housing, why would we do that? And so I think for reasons like that, people are moving again away from requiring parking. We have some of that in this ordinance, but what we have specifically is a result of that public process and trying to come to consensus across such a variety of opinions.
Okay, thank you. I'm done. We'll let other people ask.
Madam Mayor, thank you for answering more questions, Tim. One thing that I heard from a couple of different neighborhood associations was having conditions in a conditional use permit or maybe a PUD that were never fulfilled, and tools that we may have to be able to make sure those are fulfilled as part of a development. Can you talk a little bit about that? Talk about if this addresses that or how we might go about addressing that.
This does address that, but I'll speak to this, Councilmember Woodings, from the perspective of knowing these cases that we're discussing and having looked into these cases that we're discussing. And I can tell you that what happened in these occasions is that, and putting aside the issue of code enforcement for just a minute, that this is a specific thing around how the zoning ordinance deals with conditions applied to permits that go through city council. And what I can tell you is that in each of these cases, the language around those conditions was not adequate. It was vague. It wasn't specific enough around at what point must the developer install those improvements. So consistently across these cases where we haven't had improvements made for years, if you go back to the zoning, you'll scratch your head and say, why would they put it like that? This is not specific enough. And so that's what happens, so we have learned from that, and you have to be very specific. And to the points made this evening by several residents, those improvements have to be put in early in the process, and it has to be clear what the triggers are, because that consistently is what was not clear in the cases that have been described.
Great, thank you. And then my next question is related to drive-through setbacks. We heard about the need for greater setbacks between drive-throughs and residential, drive-throughs and parks and schools. Can you talk a little bit more about what the zoning code has in relation to that?
We actually have a slide on this topic. We've got a whole bunch of slides that relate to topics that we expected would come up. This is a lot of information, but let me just say, as it relates to the drive-throughs, that there was quite a debate about them as well. We started, as someone mentioned earlier this evening, limiting drive-throughs to a much larger degree than we ended up, including in this final version, because originally we were not going to permit them in some of these MX zones like MX3. We were not going to permit them at all. And we got a lot of feedback from commercial builders that, in particular, and realtors, that wasn't realistic, so we ended up shifting to a standard that would allow them in those districts, but include these design standards around how they must be located, what the design around them must be. And you all know of locations in the city where we have drive-throughs that are in the back and they're hidden and they're protected and all those kinds of things. Some of them are downtown, but some of them are not downtown. So we ended up including provisions for the design of drive-throughs. And then the 200-foot setback. Okay. The setback issue that's being discussed is the existing ordinance has a 200-foot setback within the C1 adjacent to some uses. And so as we shift to the MX zones, we don't have that setback requirement. We do have a 10-foot setback from the drive-through lane to the adjacent property. So it's that former 200-foot requirement that existed in the C1 only. And C1 is like the most intense commercial district that the city currently has. So in that C1, you've got that existing 200-foot setback. It does go away. And in the MX zones, you've got this 10-foot setback that is in the proposed ordinance. So that's an issue, yeah, to dig into this week.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Madam Mayor, some of my questions have already been asked, but I wanted to, we've obviously heard a lot about notification and public comment from most of the neighborhood associations here, especially around the type 2. And so I wondered if you could just articulate again the rationale behind the change in the code.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for that question. Let me mention first that the idea around the types 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the types 1 and 2 in particular that do not require a public hearing was never requested of us from the development community. It was mentioned a couple times tonight. I understand developers like the better process. No one asked us for this. The type 2 element of this ordinance was our effort, the planning staff's effort, to make what we want, and we say we want, and it's so important to the city as it relates to housing diversity and density in the right places, to make that easier to do. And a big part of that is to have a process that doesn't include the risk and uncertainty of public hearings. Because when you go to a public hearing, which could be P and Z or could be P and Z and city council, the level of risk and uncertainty associated with that means that most people can't do it. Unless you have the means, you have the consultants, the lawyers to go through that process, it means that most people are out of that process. And there are elements of this code that are type 2s that are very important, like those small scale residential things, a duplex, a triplex, a quadruplex that are type 2s and don't require a public hearing. Also within the type 2 is something called allowed use allowed form, which is if you're on not the whole city, but if you're in these MX3 zones or you're on one of those corridors or in the activity centers where density is helpful and we need it as a community, if you're building densely, you're at 4 stories or more, you don't have to go to a public hearing. If you're building less dense, probably a single story building with surface parking, you have to go to a public hearing. So the whole rationale behind the type 2 is to make those things that we want easier to accomplish. And so there's 2 things that have been requested related to the type 2. Well, I think there's one primary thing that's been requested related to the type 2, and you heard that tonight, which is just to notify the neighbors in those cases, which we currently are not requiring in this version of the code. But so I think the step that's been requested really has been that notification. So if we get a type 2 application, that we would go ahead, and I think even one of the last speakers spoke to, when you get that application, you're approving something, just send out that notice to the neighbors, the postcard or whatever, and that's what's been requested as the change. But I do think it's important that that not shift into a public hearing process, or you start to lose the point of, you know, making what we want easier to do.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. My last question. Back to the CUPs, can you comment a little bit about the concern of having the language about, you know, for the public benefit, for the public good, making it potentially have a negative impact on low income, either renters or homeowners in various areas?
I'm sorry, council member, could you say that one more time?
The language in the CUPs that's now added, that the phrase that allows us to evaluate if it's in the public benefit or for the public good. I can't remember the exact language, but it came up a couple of times tonight, that there's an argument there that means that we can always make an argument that's for the public benefit as opposed to taking the interest of the areas around there.
Thank you. I think what that relates to is concerns as it relates to the findings for a conditional use permit being such that it would enable us to make a decision. And the reference is really the shelter discussion of last year and the conditional use permit associated with the shelter, and the concern that that language change within the conditional use findings is changing somehow to benefit shelters, or, you know, to give the city a position through those findings to be more enabling of shelters, where we said since last summer we were not going to make changes within this code related to shelters. I think, council member, is that what you're?
I've also heard it from a low income housing framework, that it would allow us to provide other conditional uses that might displace low-income residents more readily.
Well, that's interesting, since we added a conditional use requirement in this code in any case where, and we've added it to R2 and R3 districts tonight, in any case, which we don't have currently in the ordinance, in any case that you're displacing assisted living, nursing home, mobile home park, naturally occurring affordable housing at 60% or less of area median income, you now in this code have a conditional use permit requirement related to those uses, where you do not have that protection today. And that would exist, as we're proposing tonight and in the memo of June 1st, in all the MX districts and the R2 and the R3. So I don't understand that. Yeah.
I think that's good.
Madam Mayor. First question, I think, is just some clarification to a question that Council President Woodings asked earlier. And I think we're talking specifically to some trail access issues that we've seen before in the past. I wanted to make sure that I understood you. Is it that the code wasn't written strongly or specifically enough and that's changed? Or was it that council in their motion didn't give strong enough language for it to actually be enacted?
Well, I mean, it's both
Okay.
in the sense that because the new code, the code we're proposing is specific about those improvements, number one, but also, you know, we as staff, this isn't a council issue because some of these cases wouldn't come to council, but we're cognizant of the fact that important decisions the city made in the past was not clear enough about when those requirements must be installed. So it's really both, council member.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that council has ever put a fuzzy condition on any of our applications. So there's a couple things that were brought up about requests for annual reviews or reviews of the zoning code itself. Now, in my mind, part of that review happens on a daily basis when we see the code come in front of us, or on a weekly basis when we see the code come in front of us and we start to see problems or issues or inconsistencies, and we send that back to you. I'm wondering if you foresee any other formal process as far as checking in with the code periodically to make sure that it's still in line with what we intended it to do and our long-term city goals.
Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, we have been discussing that and discussed it quite a bit with the Planning and Zoning Commission and said at that time, which is important. This is an important decision for the city to make because you have other cities in this country that have adopted new zoning rules and assumed that they would not change them, that they were perfect. And they would sit on those rules for years. And that creates a lot of frustration. And we have gone into this understanding our greatest challenge is to create an ordinance, as we discussed earlier, that is commensurate with this place physically, period. And then also to create a set of regulations that we know we'll need to keep working on. So the incentives is a great example of this. We want to make sure those affordability incentives work. So we're going to have to check in with council on a regular basis. We want everyone to understand that this is going to be a community process. As I said, 1966, we weren't experts in sprawl. Today, we've got a chance to become experts in growing in the opposite direction, but it's not going to be perfect. There are aspects of it that we think are perfect, but there are lots of details that we're going to keep working on. So we think it's a regular cadence with city council. And so the most time between the adoption or the effective date of the ordinance and some kind of review would be 12 months. And honestly, early in the process, it's probably going to be more often than that we come and give a nice presentation on how we're doing those metrics that we established related to measuring how successful the ordinance is being and proposing on a regular basis where we need to do some fine tuning, not moving in a different direction, but just making sure that we're tightening it up as we move and we're experiencing it.
Perfect. Thank you. And then I think my last question for tonight, and this one may not be able to be answered right now, but there was several different people that brought up a variety of different water issues, especially groundwater issues, and then some specific requests for requirements for recharge. So not necessarily just water use, but actually requirements for recharging back into the aquifer, the groundwater. I don't know if that's
with that one. I'd ask him to come back at the end, ready with some suggestions.
Yeah, and perhaps that's maybe something the staff can come back with. Great.
Madam Mayor, Mr. Keene, I'm wondering if the criteria around conditional use permits, granting those in situations involving manufactured homes, nursing homes, et cetera, if that has changed in this proposal. I like the idea that we would have to have a conditional use permit on if the use of those properties changes. But what I'm worried about is even with a conditional use permit, do we really have the teeth to protect those types of developments?
Well, Mayor, Councilmember Nash, the only change to what's being proposed and is before you tonight, and this is reflected in that June 1st memo, is the addition of that conditional use requirement to the R2 and R3 districts and those other MX districts, because we just had it in the MX 3, 4, and 5. So we're proposing to expand that. That's the only change. We've talked a lot about this issue of adding additional requirements to those conditional uses, and we're not recommending that. We do think that the protection that's provided is the requirement that someone that's redeveloping property that would result in that displacement has to come to a public discussion around those things before Planning and Zoning Commission and before City Council, and that it's better not to there was discussion of do you recommend certain things in the zoning ordinance, have general policies, which we can develop, but the zoning ordinance isn't a place for those things. The zoning ordinance is around what are the specific zoning requirements that you have. So what we're suggesting is that the zoning ordinance's role is to require that public discussion through a conditional use permit. And then we can keep working on what are the policies, how can we make that consistent as people come through. And, we'll have cases like that. We don't want those cases necessarily, but we will have cases that require these things, that we have these requirements that we develop administratively to make those processes satisfying. Yes, Mayor. Did you? Oh, okay.
All right. That is it for this evening. I want to thank everybody, those of you that are still here, and those of you that came but have headed home and watched the recap. Really appreciate all the thought, attention, and information that was shared with us tonight. Thank the team again for the presentation, the work that went into it, and the work that's got us here. And we will see everybody tomorrow, 2 o'clock, at 2 o'clock. And so we've got a sign-up sheet that I'll start to work through. I'll probably first ask from a scheduling perspective if there are folks that really need to go for real reasons as quickly as possible. And then we'll go back and forth in some sort of order between folks online and folks in person. And right now we're scheduled to go until 6. But I'll also say we might just leave open. I'm going to leave open some flexibility towards the end to take some more folks if you're here. So with that, we will see you tomorrow. Thank you all very much.